What if the greatest miracle of your life were waiting for a single act of courage? The story of David and Goliath is not merely a biblical tale about a shepherd who defeated a giant. It is a timeless code, revealing how human boldness activates invisible forces that reorganize the entire reality around you. When a young shepherd stands before the impossible, he is not simply confronting a warrior. He is accessing a frequency of consciousness that dissolves limitations and manifests the extraordinary. In this transformative audiobook, you will discover that every Goliath in your life, whether crushing debts, broken relationships, challenging illnesses, or dreams that seem unreachable, exists to reveal the same truth David understood. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. And in that bold action, something magical happens in the quantum field of your existence, combining the ancient wisdom of the biblical narrative with the latest discoveries in neuroscience, quantum physics, and transformational psychology. This audiobook goes beyond superficial motivation. You will learn how courage literally reconfigures your brain, how boldness shifts your energetic vibration, and how every courageous step creates a cascade of synchronicities and opportunities that were previously invisible. Prepare to discover that you do not need blind faith or extraordinary abilities. You need only the courage to take the first step. And in that step, everything changes. Chapter 1. The giant that everyone faces. There's a moment in every person's life when they come face to face with something that seems absolutely impossible to overcome. It might be standing in front of a mountain of debt that grows faster than you can pay it. It could be that relationship that's been broken for so long, you've forgotten what it felt like to be whole. Perhaps it's a diagnosis that the doctors delivered with sympathetic eyes and carefully chosen words. Or maybe it's that dream you've carried in your heart since childhood, the one that still whispers to you in quiet moments, but now seems so far away that reaching for it feels like grasping at smoke. Whatever form it takes in your life, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That thing, that overwhelming, crushing, paralyzing challenge that doesn't just block your path forward, but seems to mock you every single day with its sheer impossibility. The giant that stands between you and the life you were meant to live. Here's what I need you to understand right now, before we go any further together. That giant is not your enemy. In fact, it's the exact opposite. That impossible challenge, that thing that terrifies you, that obstacle that seems insurmountable, is actually the doorway to the most extraordinary transformation you've ever experienced. I know this sounds counterintuitive. I know that right now, as you think about your particular giant, every cell in your body might be screaming that I'm wrong, that your situation is different, that your challenge is the one exception to whatever principle I'm about to share with you. But I'm asking you to stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change not just how you see your problem, but how you see yourself. Let me tell you about Sarah. She was 37 years old when her husband of 15 years walked out the door and never came back. No warning, no explanation that made sense. Just gone. In an instant, she went from being part of a family to being a single mother of 3 children under the age of 12, with a part-time job that barely covered groceries, let alone rent. The mortgage was in both their names, but he stopped paying his half. The bills piled up. The phone calls from creditors became constant. Her children asked questions she couldn't answer without breaking down. Every morning she would wake up, and for just a split second, she'd forget, and then reality would crash back in like a tidal wave, and she'd have to force herself to breathe through the panic that made her chest feel like it was collapsing. Sarah's giant was standing right in front of her every single day. Financial ruin, emotional devastation, the responsibility of 3 young lives depending on her when she could barely take care of herself. The fear that she would fail them, that she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, capable enough to do this alone. For months, she was paralyzed. She'd go through the motions, getting the kids to school, showing up to work, microwaving dinners, but inside, she was dying. The giant was winning, and she knew it. But then something shifted. It wasn't a lightning bolt moment or a divine intervention. It was actually much quieter than that. She was sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, unable to sleep again, staring at a stack of past due notices, when she had a thought that changed everything. The thought was simple. It was almost embarrassingly simple. She thought, if I'm going to go down, I might as well go down fighting. That was it. That was the moment. Not some grand realization or mystical experience. Just a quiet decision that she was tired of being paralyzed by fear, tired of letting the giant dictate every moment of her existence. She decided that if things were going to be terrible, they might as well be terrible while she was taking action, instead of terrible while she was frozen in place. Within that decision, something in her brain literally changed. Neuroscience now shows us that the moment you make a true decision, not a wish or a hope, but a genuine decision to act, regardless of the circumstances, your brain begins to fire and wire in completely new patterns. New neural pathways start forming. The part of your brain that's been stuck in fear and survival mode, the part that's been running the same loop of anxiety and despair, suddenly has competition. A new signal is being sent. A new program is being written. Sarah started small. She couldn't fix everything at once, so she didn't try. She picked up one bill, just one, and called the company. She explained her situation, not from a place of begging or shame, but from a place of simple honesty. To her surprise, they worked out a payment plan. So she called another company, then another. Some said no, some said yes, but with each call, she felt a little less powerless. She started looking for a better job, not because she thought she'd find one, but because looking was taking action, and taking action made her feel alive again in a way that being paralyzed never could. 3 months later, she had a full-time possession with benefits. 6 months later, she'd negotiated new terms on her mortgage. A year later, she was standing in a courtroom where a judge finalized her divorce and in the same breath granted her full custody and child support that would actually arrive on time. But here's the most important part of Sarah's story, the part that reveals something profound about the nature of giants and how they actually work in our lives. When I talked to Sarah 2 years after her husband left, after she'd climbed out of the pit and rebuilt her life in a way that was actually better than before, I asked her what she thought had changed. She sat quietly for a moment, and then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "The circumstances didn't change because I defeated them. I defeated them because I changed first. The giant was never out there in the bills and the broken marriage and the fear. The giant was in me. It was the belief that I was powerless. The moment I stopped believing that, everything else had to reorganize itself to match the new me. This is the secret that ancient wisdom has been trying to tell us for thousands of years. The same secret that quantum physics is now confirming in laboratories around the world. Your external reality, everything you see and experience in the physical world, is a direct reflection of your internal state of being. Not your wishes, not your hopes, not what you tell people you want. Your actual state of being, the frequency you're vibrating at, the identity you're operating from, the beliefs that are running in your subconscious mind while you go through your day. That's what creates your reality. And your giants, those massive obstacles that seem so real and so insurmountable, exist primarily to show you where your consciousness is still operating from limitation instead of possibility. Every single person who has ever lived has faced their version of this giant. The details are different, but the fundamental structure is always the same. There's something in your life that seems bigger than you, stronger than you, more powerful than you. Something that makes you feel small and weak and inadequate. Something that, when you think about facing it, triggers every fear response in your nervous system and makes you want to run, hide, or simply give up. This is not random. This is not punishment. This is not evidence that you're cursed or unlucky, or that the universe has it out for you. This is actually the universe's way of showing you exactly where your next level of growth is waiting for you. Think about it this way. If you went to the gym and only lifted weights that you could already lift easily, would you get stronger? Of course not. Your muscles only grow when they're challenged by resistance. That's greater than what they're currently capable of handling comfortably. The discomfort, the struggle, the burning sensation in your muscles, that's not a sign that something's wrong. That's the sign that something's right. That's growth happening in real time. Your life works the same way. The giants in your life, the challenges that feel overwhelming, they're not obstacles to your growth. They're the mechanism of your growth. They're the resistance that's required for you to develop strength you don't currently have. But here's where most people get it wrong. They think the goal is to defeat the giant through external action alone. They think if they just work harder, strategize better, get more resources, acquire more skills, then they'll be able to overcome the obstacle. And yes, action is absolutely necessary, but if action was all you needed, you would have already solved this problem. The reason your giant is still standing is because it's not actually a problem of action. It's a problem of consciousness. It's a problem of identity. It's a problem of who you believe yourself to be when you look at that challenge. David, the shepherd boy from the ancient texts, understood this in a way that the entire army of Israel did not. When Goliath stood in the valley and challenged the Israelites day after day for 40 days, the army saw a giant. They saw someone who was bigger, stronger, more experienced in battle, someone who was impossible to defeat. So they stayed paralyzed in their tents, day after day, choosing the familiar discomfort of fear and shame over the unknown territory of courageous action. But when David arrived and heard Goliath's challenge, he saw something completely different. He didn't see a giant. He saw an opportunity. He didn't see the impossible. He saw the inevitable. And the difference between what David saw and what the army saw had nothing to do with Goliath and everything to do with David's consciousness. You see, David had spent years alone in the fields, protecting his father's sheep from lions and bears. He'd already faced things that seemed impossible. He'd already developed an internal knowing that when he stepped into action, aligned with a power greater than himself, the outcome was certain, not hopeful, certain. His identity wasn't based on his size, or his experience, or his equipment. His identity was based on something unshakable within him. So when he looked at Goliath, he wasn't comparing Goliath's size to his own size. He was comparing Goliath's size to the size of the consciousness he was connected to. And from that perspective, there was no contest. The giant had already fallen before David threw a single stone. This is what you need to understand about your giant. The size of your challenge is irrelevant. What matters is the size of your consciousness when you face it. And here's the beautiful part, the part that changes everything. Your consciousness isn't fixed. It's not determined by your past, your genetics, your circumstances, or your history. Your consciousness is determined by the thoughts you think, the feelings you feel, the beliefs you hold, and the identity you choose to operate from. All of those things can be changed, which means Your capacity to face and transcend your giant can be expanded right now, in this moment, regardless of anything that's happened before. Modern neuroscience has given us extraordinary insights into how this works at the level of your brain and nervous system. When you perceive a threat, a challenge, or an obstacle, your brain has to make a decision about how to respond. That decision isn't made by your conscious mind. It's made by your subconscious programming, the patterns and beliefs that were installed in your neural circuitry through repetition and emotional intensity, most of them before you were even old enough to question whether they were true. If your subconscious programming says, "I'm not capable of handling this," then your brain will activate your sympathetic nervous system, flooding your body with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, preparing you for fight, flight, or free. In that state, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for complex problem-solving, creativity, and higher-level thinking, goes offline. You literally become stupider when you're afraid. Your perception narrows. Your options seem limited. The giant looks even bigger than it did before. But if your subconscious programming says, "I am more than capable of handling this," then something completely different happens. Your brain activates a different set of neural networks, ones associated with confidence, creativity, and calm. Your nervous system shifts into a state of coherence, where your heart rate becomes steady and rhythmic, sending signals to your brain that you're safe, that you have the resources you need. In this state, your prefrontal cortex stays fully online. You can think clearly. You can see options that were invisible to you just moments before. Solutions emerge that seemed impossible when you were afraid. The giant hasn't changed in size, but your capacity to deal with it has expanded dramatically, all because you changed your internal state first. This is why trying to solve your problems while you're in a state of fear and stress never works. You can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. If your current consciousness is one of limitation, powerlessness, and fear, then every action you take from that state will only create more of the same. But if you can shift your consciousness first, if you can change your internal state to one of possibility, empowerment, and certainty, then the actions you take from that state will have a completely different quality and will produce completely different results. Let me tell you about Marcus. He was a middle-aged man who had been in the same dead-end job for 20 years. He hated it. Every morning he'd drag himself out of bed, already exhausted before the day began, and force himself to go to a place where he felt undervalued, underpaid, and completely unfulfilled. He dreamed of starting his own business, something that would let him use his creativity and work on his own terms. But every time he thought about actually doing it, a wave of fear would wash over him. What if he failed? What if he lost what little financial security he had? What if people laughed at him for trying? What if he discovered that he wasn't as talented or capable as he hoped? So he stayed, week after week, month after month, year after year. The giant of fear kept him trapped in a life that was slowly killing his spirit. One day, something happened that changed everything for Marcus. It wasn't anything external. His job didn't get worse. His circumstances didn't change. What changed was a single thought that dropped into his mind while he was sitting in traffic on his way to that job he despised. The thought was, "I'm going to die one day, and when that moment comes, I'm going to have to face the fact that I chose safety over living. I'm going to have to admit that I let fear decide the shape of my life." In that moment, sitting in his car, Marcus started to cry. Not because he was sad, but because he was angry. Angry at himself for wasting so much time. angry at the fear that had controlled him for so long. And in that anger, he found something he'd lost years ago: his power. Marcus didn't quit his job the next day. He didn't make some reckless, impulsive decision, but he did make a real decision, a decision at the level of identity. He decided that he was no longer going to be the kind of man who let fear make his choices. He started taking small actions, spending an hour each evening working on a business plan, learning new skills online, talking to people who had done what he wanted to do. And here's what happened. As he took action, his fear began to shrink. Not because the risk got smaller, but because he got bigger. His identity expanded. He started seeing himself differently. Instead of identifying as a scared employee who was stuck, he began identifying as an entrepreneur in training, someone who was preparing for his next chapter. That shift in identity changed everything. Within a year, he had launched his business while still keeping his job. Within 2 years, his business was generating enough income that he could leave the job that had been his prison. Within 3 years, he was making more money doing what he loved than he ever made doing what he hated. But again, the most important part of the story isn't the external success. It's what Marcus told me when I asked him what had really changed. He said, "The giant was never the risk of starting a business. The giant was my identity as someone who couldn't do it. Once I killed that identity, the actual business part was just logistics. It was just steps to follow. The real battle was internal, and once I won that battle, everything else was inevitable." This is the pattern you'll see again and again in the stories of people who transcend their giants. The breakthrough doesn't come from changing the circumstances. It comes from changing themselves first. And when they change at the level of identity, at the level of consciousness, the circumstances have no choice but to rearrange themselves to match the new frequency they're broadcasting. This isn't mystical thinking. This is how reality actually works. Quantum physics has shown us that the observer affects the observed, that consciousness collapses the wave of infinite possibilities into specific, concrete outcome. You are not a passive victim of a predetermined reality. You are an active creator, constantly collapsing waves of possibility into your lived experience based on your state of consciousness, your beliefs, and your identity. Your giant exists to invite you into a higher version of yourself. It exists to challenge the story you've been telling about who you are and what you're capable of. It exists to reveal the gap between your current identity and your potential identity. And here's the most profound truth of all. You don't overcome your giant by becoming stronger than it. You overcome your giant by becoming someone for whom that giant is no longer a giant at all. You transcend it by evolving beyond the consciousness that created it in the first place. Every person walking this planet right now is dealing with their version of Goliath. Some giants wear the face of financial struggle. Some wear the face of health challenges. Some wear the face of broken relationships, or lost opportunities, or dreams deferred so long they've started to fade. But regardless of the costume your giant is wearing, the fundamental truth is the same. Your giant is not your obstacle. Your giant is your initiation. It's the fire you have to walk through to become the person you were always meant to be. And on the other side of that fire, you won't just have solved a problem. You'll have become someone new. Someone who knows, not just intellectually, but in the deepest part of their being, that they are more powerful than any circumstance they could ever face. The question isn't whether you can defeat your giant. The question is whether you're willing to become the person who already has, because that person exists right now as a possibility in the quantum field. That version of you who is courageous, empowered, unstoppable, That version is real. It's not fantasy. It's potential waiting to be actualized. And the bridge between where you are now and where that version of you exists is built one decision at a time, one moment of courage at a time, one act of defiance against the fear that wants to keep you small. David didn't wait until he felt ready to face Goliath. He didn't wait until he was bigger or stronger or more experienced. He stepped into the valley with nothing but 5 smooth stones and an unshakable knowing that the outcome was already determined. Not because he was special, but because he understood something that most people never learn. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is the willingness to act in alignment with who you truly are, regardless of what fear is screaming in your ear. And when you act from that place, from that deep knowing of your true nature, the universe has no choice but to meet you there. Resources appear, solutions emerge, doors open, and the giant that seemed so insurmountable begins to shrink. Not because it got smaller, but because you got so much bigger that its size became irrelevant. So as you continue through the pages of this journey, I want you to keep something close to your heart. Your giant is not your enemy. Your giant is your greatest teacher. It's showing you exactly where you need to grow, exactly what beliefs need to be upgraded, exactly what identity needs to die, so that your true self can finally emerge. And when you're ready, when you finally decide that you're done being controlled by fear and limitation, when you choose to stand up and walk into that valley regardless of how big the giant appears to be, that's the moment everything changes. That's the moment the miracle begins. Not because something magical happens outside of you, but because something profound happens within you. You remember who you really are, and in that remembering, you become unstoppable. Chapter 2. The Shepherd's Consciousness. Before David ever stood in the valley facing Goliath, before he ever picked up those 5 smooth stones, before he ever became the giant slayer that history remembers, he was nobody. He was the youngest son in a family where youngest sons didn't matter much. He was the kid who got sent out to the fields to watch sheep, while his older brothers trained for war, attended important meetings, and built their reputations. He was so insignificant that when the prophet Samuel came to his father's house, looking for the next king of Israel, nobody even bothered to call David in from the fields. They literally forgot about him. But here's what most people miss when they hear the story of David and Goliath. They think David won because he got lucky, or because God intervened in some magical way that has nothing to do with how reality actually works. They think he was just a special chosen one, and that his victory had nothing to do with anything he did or any way he prepared. And that interpretation, as comforting as it might be, robs you of the most powerful lesson this ancient story has to offer. David didn't defeat Goliath because of some random divine lottery. David defeated Goliath because of who he had become in those years when nobody was watching. He defeated Goliath because of the consciousness he had developed in the silence and solitude of the fields. You see, while everyone else was focused on building their external resume, David was building something far more valuable. He was building his internal strength. He was developing a relationship with a power that existed beyond his physical capabilities. He was learning to trust something greater than his circumstances. And he was doing it in a place where there was no audience, no applause, no recognition, just him, the sheep, and the vast, open sky. This is where real transformation happens. Not on the stage, not when people are watching, not when you're trying to impress anyone or prove anything. Real transformation happens in the hidden moments, in the daily decisions that nobody sees, in the consciousness you cultivate when you're completely alone. Let me tell you about Jennifer. She was a corporate executive who spent 20 years climbing the ladder, collecting titles, building a reputation as someone who always delivered results. From the outside, her life looked like success. Corner office, six-figure salary, respect from her peers. But inside, Jennifer was dying. She was exhausted all the time. She had stomach problems that wouldn't go away. She couldn't sleep without medication. Her relationships were shallow because she never had the energy to show up as her real self. She was playing a role, wearing a mask, and the mask had become so heavy that it was crushing her. The breaking point came during a presentation to the board of directors. She was in the middle of delivering quarterly results when something inside her just snapped. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice. But internally, she felt something break. A voice inside her head said very clearly, "This isn't your life. You're living someone else's dream, and it's killing you." She finished the presentation on autopilot, went back to her office, closed the door, and for the first time in years, she let herself feel the truth of her situation. She had spent 2 decades building an external identity that had nothing to do with who she actually was. And in that moment of raw honesty, she made a decision that terrified her. She was going to find out who she really was, even if it meant losing everything she'd built. Jennifer didn't quit her job immediately. What she did was more subtle, and ultimately more powerful. She started creating space for silence. Every morning before the chaos of her day began, she would sit in her car in the parking garage for 20 minutes and do absolutely nothing. No phone, no music, no planning. Just sitting in silence, learning to be with herself without distraction. At first it was torture. Her mind raced, her body fidgeted. Every cell in her being screamed that she should be doing something productive. But she stayed with it. Day after day after day, and slowly, something began to shift. In that silence, Jennifer started to hear a voice that had been drowned out by decades of noise. It wasn't a mystical voice or some external entity speaking to her. It was her own inner knowing, the part of her that had always known what she really wanted, but had been overridden by fear and conditioning, and the need to meet other people's expectations. That voice started telling her things. It told her that she had a gift for helping people heal from trauma. It told her that her real calling had nothing to do with spreadsheets and profit margins. It told her that she was meant to be a therapist, a guide, someone who held space for others to find themselves the way she was learning to find herself. The logical part of Jennifer's mind said this was insane. She had no training in therapy. She'd spent her entire adult life in the corporate world. Starting over would mean going back to school, taking a massive pay cut, completely rebuilding her professional identity. But the deeper part of her, the part that had been awakened in those silent mornings, knew this was true, and once she heard it, she couldn't unhear it. Within 6 months, she had enrolled in a counseling program. Within a year, she had taken a leave of absence from her job. Within 2 years, she had completed her training and opened a small practice. Today, 7 years later, Jennifer works with corporate executives who are exactly where she used to be, helping them find their way back to themselves. But here's what Jennifer told me when I asked her about that transformation. She said, "The real work wasn't going back to school or changing careers. The real work was done in those 20 minutes every morning in my car. That's where I learned to listen to myself. That's where I developed the consciousness that could perceive a different possibility for my life. Everything that came after was just the physical manifestation of the internal shift that happened in silence. This is the shepherd's consciousness. This is what David was developing during all those years in the fields that everyone else dismissed as wasted time. He wasn't building his LinkedIn profile. He wasn't networking or positioning himself or playing political games. He was learning to hear the voice of truth within himself. He was developing trust in something greater than his own limited perspective. He was cultivating a relationship with the invisible realm that actually governs all visible outcome. And he was doing it not because someone told him to, not because he thought it would lead to some future reward, but because it was the natural expression of who he was becoming. Modern neuroscience has given us fascinating insights into what happens in your brain when you spend time in silence and solitude, when you remove yourself from the constant stimulation of your environment, when you turn off the screens and the notifications and the endless stream of input. Your brain shifts into a completely different mode of operation. The default mode network, a set of brain regions that activate when you're not focused on the external world, comes online. This network is associated with self-reflection, imagination, empathy, and the integration of past experiences with future possibilities. In other words, when you get quiet, you literally give your brain permission to work on the deeper questions of who you are and who you're becoming. But there's something even more profound that happens in extended periods of silence. Your brain waves begin to slow down. Instead of operating primarily in beta waves, the fast, alert state you're in when you're actively problem-solving or engaging with the world, you drop into alpha and even theta waves. These slower brainwave states are the gateway to your subconscious mind, the place where your deepest beliefs and patterns are stored. In these states, you have access to programming that's normally hidden from your conscious awareness. You can begin to see the stories you've been telling yourself, the limiting beliefs that have been running your life, the fears that have been making your decisions, and in seeing them clearly, you gain the power to change them. David spent countless hours alone with his sheep, and in that solitude, he wasn't just passing time. He was reprogramming his consciousness. Every time a lion or a bear threatened his flock, and he chose to face it instead of running, he was installing a new program in his nervous system. He was teaching his body that courage was possible, that he was capable of facing threats far bigger than himself, that protection and provision would meet him when he stepped into action. These weren't abstract concepts he was learning from a book. These were lived experiences that became encoded in his neural circuitry, in his muscle memory, in the very cells of his body. Think about the implications of this. By the time David heard about Goliath, he had already defeated lions and bears. His nervous system had already been trained to remain calm in the face of mortal danger. His brain had already formed neural pathways that associated threat with opportunity rather than with paralysis. His identity had already been shaped by evidence that when he acted courageously, he survived and even thrived. So when he looked at Goliath, a 9-foot warrior in full armor who had been striking fear into the hearts of trained soldiers for 40 days, David's nervous system didn't trigger the same fear response that everyone else experienced. His body had learned a different truth. His consciousness operated from a different paradigm. This is what you need to understand about preparation. Real preparation isn't about acquiring more skills or more knowledge or more resources. Those things matter, but they're secondary. Real preparation is about transforming your consciousness, rewiring your nervous system, and rebuilding your identity at such a fundamental level that when opportunity or crisis arrives, you respond from your new operating system, not your old one. And this kind of preparation cannot be rushed. It cannot be faked. It can only be earned through repetition, through practice, through showing up day after day in the hidden moments when nobody is watching and choosing to be the person you're becoming rather than the person you used to be. Let me tell you about Thomas. He was a musician who dreamed of performing on big stages, But every time he got an opportunity to play in front of more than a handful of people, he would choke. His hands would shake. His voice would crack. His mind would go blank. He tried everything to overcome his stage fright. He read books about confidence. He took medication for anxiety. He even tried drinking before performances to calm his nerves. Nothing worked. The bigger the opportunity, the worse he performed. And after years of this pattern, he had almost given up on his dream entirely. Then Thomas met a mentor who told him something that changed everything. The mentor said, "You're not afraid of the stage. You're afraid of being seen. And you're afraid of being seen because you don't know who you are. You've been trying to perform as someone you think the audience wants you to be, and that person doesn't exist. So of course you fall apart when the spotlight hits you. The only way to overcome this is to spend time alone, discovering who you actually are, so that when you step on stage, you're just being yourself amplified, not pretending to be someone else." Thomas didn't understand this at first. It sounded like mystical nonsense, but he was desperate enough to try anything. So he started doing what his mentor suggested. Every single day, for at least an hour, he would go into his music room, lock the door, and play for an audience of no one. Not practice in the traditional sense, not working on technique or learning new songs, just playing, letting whatever wanted to come through him come through. Sometimes it was beautiful, sometimes it was terrible, but it was always honest. It was always him. No performance, no pretending, just pure expression from a place of authenticity. For months, nothing seemed to change externally. Thomas continued to struggle with performance anxiety when he had gigs, but something was changing internally. In those daily solo sessions, he was discovering something profound. He was finding his own voice, not the voice he thought people wanted to hear, but his actual voice, the way he naturally phrased melodies, the rhythms that felt right to him, the emotions he wanted to express. And as he became more familiar with that authentic voice, as he learned to trust it and honor it, something in him settled. His identity as a musician began to be rooted in something internal and unshakable, rather than something dependent on external validation. The breakthrough came about 8 months into this daily practice. Thomas was booked to play at a venue larger than any he'd performed at before. Based on his history, he should have been terrified. He should have spent the week before the show consumed with anxiety and self-doubt. But something was different this time. As he stood backstage, waiting to go on, he felt calm. Not because the fear was gone completely, but because underneath the fear was something stronger. A knowing. He knew who he was now. He knew what he brought to the stage. He didn't need the audience to tell him if he was good enough, because he had already answered that question for himself in 1,000 solo sessions where the only witness was his own soul. Thomas walked onto that stage and played the best show of his life, not because he was technically perfect, not because he pulled off some impressive feat, but because he was completely present, completely himself, completely free from the need to be anything other than what he was. The audience felt it. They responded to the authenticity in a way they never responded to his technically proficient but emotionally disconnected previous performances. That show led to another, then a recording contract, then a touring schedule. But Thomas will tell you that none of the external success mattered nearly as much as the internal freedom he found in those hidden hours of solitary practice. He'll tell you that the real victory wasn't winning the crowd. It was finding himself. This is the pattern of every person who accomplishes anything significant. Before the public victory, there's always a private preparation. Before the moment of triumph, there are countless moments of practice when nobody is watching. Before the identity that can stand in front of the giant, there's the work of becoming that identity in the silence and solitude. where true transformation happens. David wasn't made into a giant slayer in the valley of Elah. He was made into a giant slayer in the fields. One sheep, one lion, one bear, one moment of courage at a time. And here's the beautiful thing about this truth. It means that right now, wherever you are, whatever you're facing, the preparation you need is available to you. You don't need special circumstances. You don't need permission from anyone. You don't need to wait for the perfect time or the right opportunity. You can begin the most important work right now, in the hidden moments, in the space between your public life and your private life, in the silence where your true voice can finally be heard. What would it look like for you to create your own version of those fields where David tended sheep? What would it look like to carve out sacred time and space where you're not performing for anyone, not proving anything, not trying to be impressive, but simply showing up to do the work of becoming who you're meant to be? Maybe it's 20 minutes every morning before anyone else wakes up. Maybe it's a walk in nature where you leave your phone behind. Maybe it's a practice, a craft, a discipline that you engage in purely for the sake of your own development, not because you're going to post about it or get recognition for it, but because it feeds something essential in your soul. The consciousness of the shepherd isn't passive. It isn't weak. It isn't about hiding from life or avoiding responsibility. It's about building strength in secret, so that when the moment comes, when your Goliath appears, you're ready not just with skills or strategies, but with a completely transformed way of being. You're ready because you've already faced your fears in the hidden moments. You're ready because you've already proven to yourself that you're capable of courage when nobody is watching. You're ready because your identity has been rebuilt from the ground up, not based on what others think of you, but based on what you know to be true about yourself. David's confidence in the valley didn't come from arrogance. It didn't come from delusion or naivety. It came from evidence. He had evidence that when he faced the impossible and chose courage, he survived. He had evidence that there was a power working through him that was greater than any external threat. He had evidence that his worth and his capability weren't determined by public opinion or conventional wisdom. And all of that evidence was gathered in the secret place, in the preparation that nobody saw, in the consciousness that was cultivated far from the spotlight. This is your invitation. This is your path forward. You don't need to wait for your giant to show up before you start preparing. You don't need to wait for the perfect circumstances or the right resources or more confidence. You can start right now, today, by creating space for the kind of consciousness-building work that transforms you at the deepest level. You can start by getting quiet enough to hear your own inner voice again. You can start by choosing one small act of courage in a hidden moment, then another, until your nervous system learns a new truth about who you are and what you're capable of. The shepherd's consciousness isn't something David was born with. It's something he developed, which means it's something you can develop too. It's something that's available to every person who's willing to do the work in the hidden moments, who's willing to show up for themselves even when nobody else is watching, who's willing to practice courage in small ways, so that when the big moment arrives, courage is no longer a choice you have to force yourself to make, but simply who you are. And when you become that person, when your consciousness shifts to that frequency, your giants don't stand a chance. Not because you've become superhuman, but because you've become authentically, powerfully, undeniably yourself. Chapter 3. The Moment of Decision. There's a moment that exists between who you've been and who you're becoming. It's not a long moment. Sometimes it lasts only a few seconds, but in those seconds, everything changes. Not the circumstances around you, not the giants standing in front of you, not the opinions of the people watching. What changes is you. Something inside you shifts. A line gets crossed, A decision gets made at a level so deep that once it's made, there's no going back. This is the moment that separates those who transform their lives from those who spend decades wishing they had. This is the moment that turns potential into reality. This is the moment when courage stops being a concept you admire in others and becomes the defining characteristic of your own existence. David had this moment. It came when he heard Goliath's voice echoing through the valley, mocking the armies of Israel, challenging anyone to come and face him. The text tells us that the soldiers had been hearing this same challenge for 40 days. 40 days of the same taunting word. 40 days of the same paralyzing fear. 40 days of everyone knowing what needed to be done, but nobody being willing to do it. And then David arrived from the fields, delivered some food to his brothers, and heard Goliath's challenge for the first time. But unlike everyone else who had been hearing it for weeks, David heard it differently. He didn't hear a threat. He heard an opportunity. He didn't hear reasons why it was impossible. He heard reasons why it was necessary. And in the space between hearing Goliath's words and opening his own mouth to respond, David made a decision that would define the rest of his life. The decision wasn't, "I'll try." The decision wasn't, "Maybe I can." The decision wasn't even, "I hope this works out." The decision was, "I will." Period. No qualification, no backup plan, no hedge. Just absolute commitment to a course of action regardless of the outcome. And the moment that decision was made, everything that came after became inevitable. Not easy, not without challenge, but inevitable. Because a true decision, made at the level of identity rather than at the level of preference, has creative power. It literally reorganizes your reality to align with the decision you've made. Let me tell you about Rachel. She was 43 years old and had been in an abusive marriage for 18 years. Not physically abusive in a way that left visible marks, but emotionally and psychologically abusive in ways that had eroded her sense of self until she barely recognized the woman she saw in the mirror. Her husband controlled every aspect of her life: where she went, who she talked to, how she dressed, what she thought. He monitored her phone. He questioned every dollar she spent. He belittled her intelligence, her appearance, her worth as a human being. And she stayed. Year after year after year, she stayed. Not because she didn't know it was wrong, not because she didn't dream of leaving, but because the fear of leaving felt bigger than the pain of staying. Rachel had tried to leave 3 times before. Each time she'd pack a bag, work up her courage, tell herself this was it, and then her husband would sense what was happening and shift strategy. Sometimes he'd apologize, promise to change, tell her he couldn't live without her. Sometimes he'd threaten her, tell her she'd never make it on her own, that nobody else would ever want her. Sometimes he'd cry and play the victim, make her feel guilty for abandoning him. And every time, she'd unpack her bag and stay. Because she hadn't made a real decision. She'd made a wish. She'd made a hope. She'd made the attempt. But she hadn't made a decision. The moment of true decision came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table, and her husband was in the other room watching television. She wasn't thinking about leaving. She wasn't planning anything. She was just sitting there. And suddenly something inside her clicked. It was like a switch flipped in her consciousness. She stood up, walked to the bedroom, pulled out the suitcase, and started packing. Her husband heard the noise and came to the doorway. He started his usual routine, the threats mixed with pleas, the anger mixed with tears. But this time, something was different. Rachel didn't engage. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She just kept packing. because the decision had been made at a level deeper than anything he could access with his words. Rachel walked out the door that day with one suitcase, $200 in cash, and no plan beyond getting out. She went to a women's shelter. She slept on a cot in a room she shared with 3 other women. She had no job, no car, no support system. By every practical measure, she had made her situation worse. She had traded a house for a cot, financial security for uncertainty, the familiar for the completely unknown. But here's what Rachel told me years later when I asked her about that moment. The second I walked out that door, I felt more alive than I'd felt in 18 years. Not because my circumstances improved, they got worse, but because I had finally made a real decision. I had finally chosen myself. And in that choice, I remembered who I was. I remembered that I was more than what he told me I was. I remembered that I had power. And once I remembered that, everything else was just logistics. Within 3 months, Rachel had a job. Within 6 months, she had her own apartment. Within a year, she had reconnected with family members she hadn't been allowed to speak to. Within 2 years, she had started a non-profit organization that helped other women leave abusive situations. Today, 10 years later, Rachel has helped hundreds of women make the same decision she made on that Tuesday afternoon. And she'll tell you that the work she does isn't about providing resources or strategies, though those things matter. The work she does is about helping women access that moment of true decision, that moment when something inside them clicks, and they know not think or hope or wish, but know that they're done being small, done being controlled, done accepting a life that diminishes them. This is what neuroscience is beginning to understand about the power of decision. When you make a true decision, not a preference or a wish, but a genuine commitment, your brain releases a cascade of neurochemicals that literally change your state of consciousness. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for executive function and willpower, lights up with activity. Neural pathways that were dormant suddenly become active. Your reticular activating system, the part of your brain that filters information and determines what you pay attention to, reprograms itself to focus on resources and opportunities that support your decision. Things you couldn't see before become visible. Options you didn't know existed suddenly appear, not because they weren't there before, but because your brain wasn't looking for them. Your decision changed what your brain was programmed to see. But there's something even more profound that happens at the quantum level. Quantum physics has shown us that reality exists in a state of infinite possibility until consciousness interacts with it and collapses those possibilities into specific outcome. Your decision is an act of consciousness. It's you declaring to the universe, to the quantum field, to the invisible realm that governs all visible outcome, what reality you're choosing to experience. And in that declaration, possibilities that were undefined begin to take form. The path forward, which seemed impossible before your decision, begins to materialize, not because the circumstances changed, but because you changed, and reality reorganizes itself around your new state of being. David understood this at a level that transcends intellectual knowledge. When he told King Saul that he would fight Goliath, he wasn't making a prediction. He wasn't expressing hope or confidence. He was making a declaration of what was already true in the invisible realm, and his words were the bridge that would bring that truth into physical reality. He said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Notice the certainty in those words. Not might deliver me, or I hope will deliver me. Will deliver me. The decision was made. The outcome was certain. Everything else was just the unfolding of what had already been determined in consciousness. Let me tell you about Michael. He was a successful lawyer who woke up one morning and realized he couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't go to the office. Couldn't argue cases he didn't believe in. Couldn't spend another day in a career that was making him financially comfortable, but spiritually dead. He had a mortgage, 2 kids in private school, a wife who had built her entire identity around being married to a successful attorney. Walking away from his career would mean disappointing everyone, losing the respect of his peers, possibly destroying his marriage, definitely creating financial chaos. For months, he wrestled with this, knowing that he needed to leave, but couldn't figure out how to do it responsibly. He made lists of pros and cons. He talked to therapists. He prayed. He waited for a sign that would tell him it was safe to make the change. But the sign never came. The path never became clear. The timing never felt right. Then one morning, Michael was in the shower, and he had a realization that changed everything. He realized he was waiting for permission. He was waiting for the circumstances to tell him it was okay to make the decision his heart had already made. He was waiting for external validation of an internal truth, and in that moment, he understood that he could wait his entire life and never get that permission. The circumstances would never make it easy. The timing would never be perfect. The path would never be clear until he decided to walk it. So right there, standing in the shower with shampoo running down his face, Michael made the decision. Not a plan, not a strategy, a decision. He was leaving the law. He didn't know what he would do instead. He didn't know how he'd handle the financial implications. He didn't know if his marriage would survive. But the decision was made. Michael got out of the shower, got dressed, drove to his office, and resigned. His partners thought he was having a breakdown. His wife thought he was being irresponsible. His friends thought he was throwing away everything he'd worked for. But Michael had tapped into something they couldn't understand. He had accessed the power of true decision, and once that power was activated, nothing could stop it. Within a week, he was contacted by an old law school friend who was starting a nonprofit focused on criminal justice reform and needed someone with Michael's expertise. The position paid a fraction of what he'd been making, but it was work that mattered, work that aligned with his values. Within a month, his wife admitted that she'd been just as unhappy with their life as he had been, and they started rebuilding their marriage on a foundation of authenticity instead of appearance. Within 6 months, they downsized their house, pulled their kids out of private school, and restructured their entire life around what actually mattered to them instead of what they thought they were supposed to do. But here's what Michael told me when I asked him about that decision in the shower. Nothing changed externally until I changed internally. The opportunity with the nonprofit didn't exist before I made the decision. My wife didn't suddenly become more understanding because circumstances improved. Reality literally rearranged itself to match my decision. And the crazy thing is, once I understood that, once I saw how powerful a true decision is, I realized I'd been giving away my power for years by refusing to make real decisions. I'd been waiting for life to happen to me, instead of happening to life. This is the shift that David made in the moment he heard Goliath's challenge and decided to respond. He stopped being someone to whom life happened and became someone who happened to life. He stopped waiting for the right moment and made the moment right through the power of his decision. And this shift is available to you right now, regardless of your circumstances, regardless of your history, regardless of how stuck you've felt or how long you've been waiting for things to change. But I need to be clear about something important. The kind of decision I'm talking about isn't the same as the hundreds of decisions you make every day. It's not a decision about what to have for breakfast or which route to take to work. Those are preferences, choices made at the level of convenience. The decisions that change your life are made at a different level entirely. They're made at the level of identity. They're made at the level of truth. They're made at the moment when you can no longer tolerate the gap between who you're being and who you know you're capable of becoming. These decisions come with a cost. Always, they require you to let go of the familiar, even when the familiar is comfortable. They require you to disappoint people, even people you love. They require you to step into the unknown without a guarantee of success. They require you to burn bridges, to close doors, to make your decision so complete that retreat is no longer an option. This is why most people never make these kinds of decisions. Not because they don't want things to change, but because they want things to change without having to sacrifice anything. They want transformation without death. They want resurrection without a cross. And it doesn't work that way. Real decision requires you to die to who you've been, so that who you're becoming can finally emerge. David's decision to face Goliath meant he was choosing possible death over certain shame. He was choosing to risk everything rather than play it safe. He was choosing to stand alone in the valley rather than hide with the crowd in the tent. And that choice, that willingness to sacrifice security for truth, is what gave his decision creative power. Because the universe, the quantum field, God, whatever name you want to give to the creative force that governs reality, responds to commitment. It responds to the person who says, "I will," and means it at the level of their soul. It doesn't respond to, "I'll try," or "I hope," or "maybe if the circumstances are right." It responds to the decision that's made without contingency, the decision that's made from a place of such absolute knowing that failure isn't even considered as a possibility. Think about the moments in your own life when you've made real decisions, not the small daily choices, but the big ones. The moment you decided to leave a relationship that wasn't serving you. The moment you decided to pursue a dream, even though everyone said it was impractical. The moment you decided to speak your truth, even though it would cost you friendships. The moment you decided to stop pretending and start living authentically. If you look back at those moments honestly, you'll see that they all have something in common. They all involved letting something die so that something else could be born. They all required you to step into identity. They all demanded that you trust yourself more than you trusted the circumstances. And they all changed the trajectory of your life in ways that wouldn't have been possible if you'd played it safe. The moment of decision is where your power lives. Not in the outcome, not in the success or failure of what happens after, but in the decision itself. Because in the moment you make a true decision, you reclaim your authority as a creator of your reality. You stop being a victim of circumstances and become an architect of possibility. You stop waiting for permission and start granting yourself permission. You stop looking for the path and start becoming the path. And in that transformation, you access a level of power that's been dormant inside you, waiting for this exact moment to be awakened. David didn't become powerful when Goliath fell. He became powerful when he decided to step into the valley. The giant's defeat was just the inevitable consequence of a decision that had already reorganized reality at the level of consciousness. And your giants work the same way. They don't fall because you acquire more skills or more resources or better timing. They fall because you make a decision that's so absolute, so complete, so rooted in truth, that reality has no choice but to conform to the new frequency you're broadcasting. So here's the question you need to ask yourself. What decision have you been avoiding? What truth have you been dancing around because you're afraid of what it will cost you to honor it? What part of your life is waiting for you to stop wishing and start deciding. Because I promise you, on the other side of that decision, everything changes. Not because the circumstances become easier, but because you become someone for whom those circumstances are no longer obstacle. You become someone who has chosen themselves, chosen truth, chosen courage over comfort, and that someone, that version of you who has made the decision, is unstoppable. Not because they're fearless, but because they've decided that their fear no longer gets to make their choices. And in that decision, miracles become not just possible, but inevitable. Chapter 4. The 5 Stones of Preparation. After David made his decision to face Goliath, he didn't immediately rush into battle. He didn't let his courage become recklessness. He didn't mistake boldness for unpreparedness. Instead, the ancient text tells us something fascinating. He went down to the brook and carefully chose 5 smooth stones and placed them in his shepherd's bag. 5 stones. Not 1, not 10, not a bag full. Exactly 5. And they had to be smooth, not jagged or rough. He was intentional. He was deliberate. He was preparing for the moment that would define his life. And he understood something that most people miss when they hear this story. Courage without preparation is just bravado. Vision without preparation is just fantasy. Desire without preparation is just wishing. But courage combined with preparation becomes unstoppable. Those 5 stones represent something profound about how transformation actually works in your life. They weren't random. They weren't arbitrary. Each one represented a dimension of readiness that David had cultivated, a level of preparation that went far beyond just having a weapon. And when you understand what those 5 stones really symbolize, when you grasp the deeper truth they're pointing, you gain access to a framework for preparing yourself to face any giant in your life, no matter how impossible it seems. The first stone represents mental preparation. David had clarity. He knew exactly what he was facing, and he wasn't in denial about the magnitude of the challenge. Goliath was over 9 feet tall, covered in armor, experienced in warfare, and had been striking fear into an entire army for 40 days. David didn't minimize that. He didn't pretend it would be easy. He didn't tell himself comforting lies about how the giant wasn't really that big. He saw the reality clearly, but he also saw something else. He saw beyond the physical reality to the invisible truth that governed the outcome. His mind was prepared, not with delusion, but with a perspective that included both the challenge and the power that was greater than the challenge. Let me tell you about Diana. She was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer at 39 years old. 2 young children, a demanding career, and suddenly her entire life was about treatments and scans and statistics that terrified her. The doctors laid out her options, and the success rate was somewhere around 60%. Those odds haunted her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that number, 60%, which meant 40% didn't make it, which meant there was nearly a 50-50 chance she could die and leave her children without a mother. For weeks, she was paralyzed by that number, by the fear of what might happen, by the horror of imagining her kids growing up without her. But then Diana had a conversation with a woman who had survived the same diagnosis 10 years earlier. This woman told her something that shifted everything. She said, "You can focus on the 40% who don't make it, or you can focus on the 60% who do. Both numbers are real. Both outcomes are possible. But the one you focus on will determine the state of your nervous system, and the state of your nervous system will determine how your body responds to treatment. You get to choose what you focus on, and that choice is more powerful than you realize." Diana started doing something that her logical mind told her was crazy, but her deeper knowing told her was essential. Every morning she would sit in meditation and visualize herself not just surviving, but thriving. She'd see herself at her daughter's wedding 20 years in the future. She'd see herself playing with grandchildren. She'd see herself old and wrinkled and full of stories about the time she faced death and won. She wasn't denying the reality of her diagnosis. She wasn't pretending the cancer wasn't serious. She was preparing her mind to focus on the outcome she wanted rather than the outcome she feared. She was choosing, deliberately and consciously, what reality she was going to align herself with. The mental preparation wasn't about positive thinking in some shallow, superficial way. It was about training her brain to operate from possibility rather than from fear. And neuroscience backs this up. Studies have shown that your thoughts literally create neural pathways, and those pathways determine what your brain looks for in your environment. If your brain is wired to look for danger, it will find evidence of danger everywhere and keep you in a constant state of stress. But if your brain is wired to look for possibility, for solutions, for evidence that you're capable of overcoming challenges, it will find that evidence and keep you in a state of empowerment. Diana wasn't just thinking positive thoughts. She was rewiring her brain to support the outcome she was choosing. Diana went through surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. It was brutal. There were days she couldn't get out of bed. There were nights she cried until she had no tears left. But through all of it, she maintained her mental preparation. She kept visualizing herself as the woman who survived, who thrived, who turned this nightmare into a testimony of human resilience. And today, 7 years later, Diana is cancer-free. She's healthier now than she was before the diagnosis. She runs marathons. She started a foundation to help other women facing cancer. And she'll tell you that the physical treatment saved her body, but the mental preparation saved her life. Because without it, she would have gone through the same treatments from a place of fear and defeat, and the outcomes would have been completely different. The second stone represents emotional preparation. David wasn't numb to his emotions. He felt the weight of what he was about to do. He felt the fear that comes with facing mortality. But his emotions didn't control him. He had learned, in those years in the fields, how to feel his feelings without letting them dictate his actions. He had developed emotional mastery, not in the sense of suppressing or denying his emotions, but in the sense of being able to experience them fully while still choosing his response rather than reacting unconsciously. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of courage. People think courage means you don't feel afraid. But that's not courage. That's either ignorance or numbness. Real courage is feeling the fear completely, acknowledging it, honoring it even, and then acting anyway. It's the ability to hold two seemingly contradictory truths at the same time. I am afraid, and I am moving forward. David felt fear, but he had prepared himself emotionally to not let that fear become his identity, not let it become the primary signal that determined his choices. Let me tell you about James. He was a veteran who came back from combat with severe PTSD. He couldn't sleep without nightmares. He couldn't be in crowds without panic attacks. He couldn't hear loud noises without his entire body going into fight-or-flight mode. His relationships fell apart. He lost his job. He spent 2 years barely functioning, just trying to survive each day. The VA gave him medication that helped a little, but mostly just made him feel numb. He went to therapy, but talking about the trauma seemed to make it worse, not better. He was drowning, and he couldn't find a way out. Then James discovered something that changed his relationship with his emotions entirely. He started working with a therapist who specialized in somatic experiencing, a method that focuses on how trauma is stored in the body, not just in the mind. This therapist, taught him something radical. His emotions weren't the enemy. The panic attacks, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, these weren't signs that something was wrong with him. They were his nervous system's attempt to process experiences that were too overwhelming to process in the moment they happened. His body was trying to complete a survival response that got interrupted by trauma. James learned to stop fighting his emotions and start witnessing them. When a panic attack would start, instead of trying to suppress it or run from it, he would sit with it. He would feel where it lived in his body. He would notice the tightness in his chest, the shaking in his hands, the racing of his heart. And he would breathe, not to make the feelings go away, but to give his nervous system permission to complete the cycle it needed to complete. At first, this was terrifying. It felt like the panic would consume him. But slowly, over weeks and months, something shifted. The panic attacks didn't go away immediately, but they started to run their course. Faster, they started to feel less like an enemy invading him and more like a wave moving through him. He started to understand that he could feel intense emotions without being destroyed by them. This emotional preparation, this ability to be with his feelings without letting them control him, changed everything for James. He started sleeping better. He could go to the grocery store without having a meltdown. He reconnected with his family. He found a new job. And most importantly, he developed a sense of trust in himself that he'd lost in the war. He learned that he could handle whatever emotions arose because he'd already handled the worst ones and survived. That's emotional preparation. That's the second stone. Not the absence of difficult emotions, but the capacity to remain centered and grounded, even when those emotions are surging through you. The third stone represents physical preparation. David's body was ready for the battle. He'd spent years walking miles through rough terrain, carrying sheep, fighting off predators. His muscles were strong, his reflexes were sharp, his coordination was precise. When he picked up that sling and stone, it wasn't the first time his hands had held them. He'd practiced 1,000 times when no one was watching. His body knew what to do, because he'd trained it to know. Physical preparation isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about your body being in a state that can support the demands you're about to place on it. Let me tell you about Patricia. She was a single mother working 2 jobs to support her 3 kids. She was exhausted all the time. She ate whatever was fast and cheap because she didn't have time or money for healthy meals. She never exercised because by the time she got home from work, she barely had energy to help her kids with homework before collapsing into bed. She was only 35, but she felt like she was 60. Her body ached constantly. She got sick frequently. She was always operating on empty, running on stress hormones and caffeine, barely surviving. One day, Patricia's youngest daughter said something that broke her heart and woke her up at the same time. They were at the park, and her daughter asked if she would come play on the swings. Patricia was too tired. She told her daughter she'd watch from the bench, and her daughter, with the brutal honesty of a 7-year-old, said, "You never play with us anymore, Mommy. You're always too tired. I wish you had energy like other moms." In that moment, Patricia saw herself through her daughter's eyes and realized that she was so focused on providing for her kids financially that she wasn't actually present for them in the ways that mattered most. She was giving them survival, but not life. Patricia made a decision that day that her body was going to become her ally instead of her obstacle. She didn't have money for a gym membership or a personal trainer. She didn't have time for elaborate meal prep. But she started small. She started walking. 20 minutes every morning before the kids woke up. Just walking. At first it was torture. Her body protested every step. But she kept going, week after week. And slowly, her body started to change. Not just her physical body, though she did lose weight and build muscle, but her energy changed. The walking woke something up in her that had been dormant. She started sleeping better. She started making slightly better food choices, not because she was following some strict diet, but because her body started craving real food instead of just sugar and caffeine. 6 months later, Patricia was walking 5 miles every morning. She'd get up at 5, walk, come home energized, and actually have the capacity to be present with her kids. The walking became her meditation, her therapy, her preparation for the day. A year later, she'd saved enough money to buy a used bicycle, and she started riding to one of her jobs instead of taking the bus. Not only did this save her money, but it made her even stronger. Her body, which had been a source of limitation, became a source of power. And when an opportunity came for a better job that required more energy and focus, Patricia was ready because she'd prepared her physical body to meet the demand. The 4th stone represents spiritual preparation. David's confidence didn't come from believing in himself in some shallow, self-help way. It came from his connection to something greater than himself. He knew he wasn't walking into that valley alone. He had cultivated a relationship with the divine, with the source of all power, with the creative force that animates all of existence. This wasn't religious performance. This was lived experience. He'd felt that power move through him when he faced the lion. He'd felt it again with the bear. He knew what it felt like to be aligned with something that transcended his personal limitations. Let me tell you about Marcus. He was a successful entrepreneur who had built multiple businesses and made millions of dollars. From the outside, he had everything, but inside, he felt empty. He'd chased success thinking it would fill the void he felt, but it didn't. He'd accumulated wealth thinking it would give him security, but it didn't. He had everything he thought he wanted and nothing that actually satisfied him. He was having what people call a spiritual crisis, a moment when you realize that all the external achievements in the world can't answer the internal questions that keep you up at night. Questions like, what's the point? Why am I here? Is this all there is? Marcus started searching for something, though he couldn't articulate what. He read philosophy. He tried meditation. He went to retreats. He talked to priests and rabbis and monks. And slowly, through all of that exploration, something shifted in him. He started to feel connected to something larger than his own ego, his own agenda, his own limited perspective. He couldn't fully explain it, but he started to sense that there was an intelligence moving through his life, through all life, that was far wiser than his conscious mind. He started trusting that intelligence, instead of trying to control every outcome through force of will. This spiritual preparation changed how Marcus operated in his businesses. He stopped making decisions purely based on profit and started making decisions based on alignment. Does this feel right? Does this serve something beyond just my own benefit? Is this in harmony with the deeper purpose I'm starting to sense? And paradoxically, as he let go of his death grip on control and started operating from this place of spiritual alignment, his businesses became even more successful, not because he was working harder or being smarter, but because he was flowing with something instead of fighting against everything. Marcus told me that spiritual preparation isn't about adopting a particular religion or belief system. It's about recognizing that you're part of something infinite, something that existed before you were born and will exist after you die, and learning to align yourself with that something instead of trying to be the center of your own universe. When you do that, when you prepare yourself spiritually, you stop carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. You stop thinking everything depends on you. You start trusting that you're being guided, supported, held by a force that knows far more than your limited conscious mind could ever comprehend. The fifth stone represents relational preparation. David wasn't isolated. Even though he'd spent years alone in the fields, he was part of a family, part of a community, part of a larger story. He knew his brothers, even the ones who mocked him. He knew King Saul, even though the king doubted him. He knew his people, the ones whose freedom depended on someone having the courage to face Goliath. He was connected, and that connection, that sense of being part of something larger than himself, gave him strength. You weren't designed to face your giants alone. You were designed to be in relationship, to draw strength from others even as you give strength to them. Let me tell you about Sophia. She was brilliant, successful, and completely alone. She'd climbed the corporate ladder faster than anyone in her company's history. She'd sacrificed relationships for career advancement, telling herself she'd have time for connection later, after she achieved her goals. But later never came. She reached the top and looked around to realize she had no one to celebrate with. No close friends, no romantic partner, no community. She'd optimized her life for achievement and completely neglected her need for belonging. Sophia's wake-up call came when she ended up in the hospital with what the doctors called stress-induced cardiac symptoms. Her body was literally breaking down from the isolation and pressure. While she was lying in that hospital bed, she had time to reflect on what her life had become, and she realized that she'd built an impressive career, but a poverty-stricken life. She had everything and nothing at the same time. When she was discharged, she made a decision that her relational life was going to become as important as her professional life. Sophia started small. She joined a book club. She volunteered at a community center. She started having regular phone calls with family members she'd been too busy to talk to for years. She made herself vulnerable enough to let people actually know her, not just the polished professional version she presented at work, but the real her with doubts and fears and longing. And slowly, over time, she built a network of genuine relationships. People who cared about her as a person, not as a title or a position. People who would show up if she needed help. People who celebrated her wins and held her through her losses. 2 years after her hospital stay, Sophia faced the biggest challenge of her career, a hostile takeover attempt of her company. It was brutal, complex, and required everything she had to navigate. But this time, she didn't face it alone. She had people she could call at 2 in the morning when the anxiety was crushing her. She had friends who reminded her of her worth when the stress made her doubt herself. She had a community that held her steady when everything felt like it was falling apart. And she not only survived that challenge, she emerged from it stronger. Not because she'd become more competent professionally, but because she'd prepared herself relationally. She'd built a support system that could hold her when she couldn't hold herself. These 5 stones, these 5 dimensions of preparation, this is what David carried with him into the valley. Mental clarity, emotional mastery, physical readiness, spiritual alignment, relational support, each stone smooth, each stone chosen with care, each stone representing a level of preparation that went far beyond just having a weapon. And when you prepare yourself in these 5 dimensions, when you take the time to get ready, not just externally, but internally, not just physically, but spiritually, not just individually, but relationally, you become someone who can face anything. Not because you're superhuman, but because you're fully human. Not because you're fearless, but because you're prepared. And preparation transforms courage from a momentary burst of bravado into a sustainable way of being that can carry you through any challenge life throws at you. Chapter 5. The Refusal of Saul's Armor. When King Saul heard that David was willing to fight Goliath, he did what any well-meaning authority figure would do. He tried to help. He called David into his tent and dressed him in his own armor, the royal armor, the best protection available in all of Israel, a bronze helmet for his head, a coat of mail for his body, a sword at his side. Saul was being generous. He was giving David every advantage he could offer. He was trying to ensure David's survival by clothing him in what had worked for Saul, what had kept Saul safe in countless battles. And for a moment, David stood there wearing the king's armor, weighted down by someone else's protection, unable to move freely, unable to be himself. The ancient text tells us something profound in this moment. It says David tried to walk in the armor but couldn't, because he had not tested it, so he took it all off. He looked at the king and said, essentially, I cannot go in these, for I have not tested them. Was, and then he walked out of that tent with nothing but his shepherd's staff, his sling, and those 5 smooth stones. He walked out as himself, not as a version of Saul, not as who people thought he should be, not wearing the armor of expectation or tradition or conventional wisdom. He walked out as David, the shepherd boy who knew exactly who he was and refused to be anyone else, even if being someone else seemed safer. This moment is one of the most critical turning points in the entire story, and it's one that most people completely miss. Because this wasn't just about armor. This was about identity. This was about authenticity. This was about the courage to refuse what doesn't fit you, even when it's being offered by someone with authority, even when it seems like it would give you a better chance of success, even when everyone around you is telling you that you're crazy to turn it down. David understood something that took me decades to learn. You cannot defeat your giant while pretending to be someone you're not. You cannot win your battle wearing someone else's armor. You cannot fulfill your purpose while trying to live up to other people's expectations of who you should be. Let me tell you about Elena. She grew up in a family of doctors. Her father was a surgeon. Her mother was a pediatrician. Her older brother was in medical school. From the time she was young, it was simply assumed that she would become a doctor, too. Nobody asked her if that's what she wanted. It was just the path that was laid out for her, the armor she was expected to wear. And Elena, being a good daughter who wanted to please her parents, who wanted to belong to her family's legacy, put on that armor and started walking in it. She studied pre-med in college. She took the MCAT. She got accepted to a prestigious medical school. From the outside, everything looked perfect. She was following the script, walking the path, wearing the armor that her family had crafted for her. But inside, Elena was suffocating. She hated studying medicine. The coursework felt like torture. The thought of spending her life in hospitals and clinics made her feel physically ill. But she couldn't articulate why, because she'd never given herself permission to ask what she actually wanted. She'd been so busy trying to fit into the armor her family had made for her that she'd never stopped to consider whether the armor fit. The breaking point came during her second year of medical school. She was in an anatomy lab, and suddenly she couldn't breathe. A full-blown panic attack. She had to leave the room. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 2 hours, hyperventilating, feeling like she was dying. And in that moment of crisis, something became absolutely clear. She could not do this. Not for one more day. Not for one more hour. The armor was killing her. Elena went home that weekend and told her parents she was leaving medical school. The reaction was exactly what she feared. Her father was furious. He told her she was throwing away her future, wasting her potential, embarrassing the family. Her mother cried and asked where they had gone wrong, what they had failed to give her that would make her give up on such a prestigious path. Her brother stopped speaking to her altogether. For months, her family treated her like she'd betrayed them, like she'd committed some unforgivable sin by choosing a different path than the one they'd chosen for her. But here's what happened next. With the armor removed, with the weight of other people's expectations finally lifted off her shoulders, Elena started to discover who she actually was. She'd always loved art, but had never pursued it because it wasn't practical, wasn't respectable, wasn't what her family valued. She started taking painting classes. She started spending hours in her small apartment just creating, experimenting, following her own curiosity without anyone telling her what she should be doing. And she discovered that when she was painting, she felt alive in a way she'd never felt in a medical classroom. She felt like herself. She felt like she was finally breathing after years of suffocation. 5 years later, Elena is a working artist. She doesn't make as much money as she would have as a doctor, but she makes enough to support herself. More importantly, she makes art that moves people, that speaks to something deep in the human experience. Her family eventually came around. It took time, but they began to see that she was happier, healthier, more fully alive than she'd ever been when she was trying to be what they wanted her to be. And Elena told me something I'll never forget. She said, "The day I took off that armor, the day I refused to keep pretending I was someone I wasn't, that was the day I actually started living. Before that, I was just existing in someone else's story. Now I'm writing my own." This is what Saul's armor represents in your life. It's the expectations that other people have placed on you. It's the version of success that society has told you to pursue, even if it doesn't resonate with your soul. It's the career path that looks good on paper, but feels wrong in your gut. It's the relationship that everyone thinks is perfect, but makes you feel invisible. It's the identity you've constructed to please your parents, impress your peers, or fit into a world that rewards conformity over authenticity. And here's the truth that nobody wants to tell you. That armor will protect you from something, but it will also prevent you from becoming who you're meant to be. It will keep you safe, but it will also keep you small. It will help you survive, but it will stop you from truly living. The courage to refuse Saul's armor is different from the courage to face Goliath. It's more subtle. It's quieter. But in many ways, it's harder. Because when you refuse the armor, you're not just rejecting a thing. You're rejecting the people who gave it to you. You're disappointing the ones who thought they were helping you. You're choosing to stand alone rather than stand in line. You're saying, "I know you mean well, but this isn't me, and I'd rather face my giant as myself and fail than face my giant as someone else and succeed." Let me tell you about Robert. He was a third-generation pastor in a conservative church. His grandfather had founded the church. His father had led it for 30 years. And from the time Robert was a teenager, everyone assumed he would take over when his father retired. Robert went to seminary, not because he felt called to ministry, but because it was expected. He married the kind of woman a pastor is supposed to marry. He preached the sermons he was supposed to preach, said the things he was supposed to say, lived the life he was supposed to live, and he was miserable because Robert had questions, deep, troubling questions about the dogma he was supposed to defend. He had doubts about the theology he was supposed to teach. He had a vision for what the church could be that was radically different from what it was. But he kept all of that hidden because the armor of tradition, the armor of expectation, the armor of his family's legacy was too heavy to take off. Robert's turning point came when his father had a stroke, and suddenly Robert was thrust into full leadership of the church at 38 years old. For the first few months, he tried to keep wearing the armor. He tried to be his father, to lead the way his father had led, to maintain the traditions and the status quo. but it was exhausting. He felt like a fraud every time he stepped into the pulpit. And then one Sunday, something inside him broke. He got up to preach his prepared sermon, the safe sermon, the one that would comfort the congregation and maintain the peace. But when he opened his mouth, different words came out. He started speaking from his heart instead of from his notes. He started sharing his doubts, his questions, his vision for a church that was more about love and less about judgment, more about inclusion and less about exclusion, more about transformation and less about performance. Half the congregation loved it. Half the congregation was horrified. Within 3 months, Robert lost 40% of the church members. People who had known him since he was a child stopped speaking to him. Elders demanded he resign. His mother told him he was destroying his father's legacy. The pressure to put the armor back on, to return to the safe traditional approach, was immense. But Robert had tasted what it felt like to be authentic, to speak his truth, to lead from his actual beliefs rather than from inherited dogma. And he couldn't go back. He told the board that if they wanted the old version of the church, they'd need to find a different pastor because he was done pretending to be someone he wasn't. Some people left, but others stayed, and new people started coming. People who had been wounded by traditional religion, people who were hungry for something more authentic, more real, more aligned with the kind of spirituality that honored questions and doubt as much as it honored faith and certainty. Within 2 years, the church had grown larger than it had ever been under his father's leadership. But more importantly, it had become a place where people could be themselves, where authenticity was valued over performance, where transformation was prioritized over tradition. And Robert told me that the moment he took off his father's armor, the moment he refused to keep being who everyone expected him to be, that was when he actually became an effective leader. Because people don't follow armor, they follow authenticity. They follow someone who has the courage to be themselves, even when it costs them something. This pattern repeats itself in every area of life. You cannot build a meaningful career while trying to be what your parents wanted you to be. You cannot create a fulfilling relationship while wearing the armor of who you think you should be to be loved. You cannot make your unique contribution to the world while trying to fit into someone else's definition of success. The armor might look impressive. It might make you feel safer. It might even work for the person who gave it to you. But if it's not yours, if it doesn't fit who you actually are, it will limit you far more than it will protect you. Here's what modern psychology understands about authenticity and performance. When you're trying to be someone you're not, when you're wearing armor that doesn't fit, a significant portion of your cognitive and emotional resources are devoted to maintaining the facade. You're constantly monitoring yourself, editing your words, managing other people's perceptions, making sure you don't slip up and reveal who you really are. This takes enormous energy. It creates what psychologists call cognitive load, and that load reduces your capacity for creativity, spontaneity, genuine connection, and peak performance. But when you show up as yourself, when you take off the armor and let people see the real you, all of that energy becomes available for actually living your life instead of managing your image. Let me tell you about Daniel. He was a successful investment banker who had everything that was supposed to matter. The corner office in Manhattan, the 6-figure bonuses, the luxury apartment, the expensive suits. His colleagues envied him. His parents bragged about him at every family gathering. He was the golden child who had made it, who had achieved the American dream. But Daniel had a secret that was eating him alive. He hated finance. He'd always hated it. He'd gone into banking because his father was a banker, because it was prestigious, because it paid well, because it was what successful people were supposed to do. But every single day, he felt like he was dying inside. What Daniel really wanted, what he'd always wanted since he was a kid, was to be a teacher. He loved working with young people. He loved the idea of shaping minds, of making a real difference in someone's life. But his father had made it very clear that teaching was beneath their family. You don't throw away an Ivy League education to babysit teenagers, his father had said when Daniel brought it up in college. So Daniel had put on the armor of financial success, climbed the ladder, made the money, and suffocated his soul in the process. Daniel's breaking point came during a particularly brutal week at work. He'd just closed a deal that made his firm millions, but would result in hundreds of people losing their jobs. He was being celebrated as a hero at work, while feeling like a villain in his own heart. That weekend, he volunteered at a youth center in Brooklyn, something he did secretly to maintain some connection to what he actually cared about. A 15-year-old kid asked him what he did for a living. When Daniel said he was a banker, the kid's face fell with disappointment. "Oh," the kid said, "I thought you were someone who actually helped people." Those words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He went home that night and couldn't sleep. He realized he'd spent 15 years building a life that impressed everyone but satisfied no one, least of all himself. The armor of success, the armor of his father's approval, the armor of financial security had become a prison. At 38 years old, he made a decision that everyone thought was insane. He quit his job, enrolled in a teaching certification program, and took a position at a public high school in the Bronx, making 1/5 of his previous salary. His father didn't speak to him for 2 years. His colleagues thought he'd had a nervous breakdown. His friends couldn't understand why he'd throw away such a successful career. But Daniel told me something profound when I asked him about that decision. He said, "The day I took off that armor, the day I stopped being who my father wanted me to be and started being who I actually was, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in 15 years. I lost a lot. I lost income, status, my father's approval, friends who only valued me for what I did rather than who I was. But I gained something infinitely more valuable. I gained my life back. I gained the ability to look at myself in the mirror and recognize the person looking back at me. And I gained the knowledge that I'm spending my days doing something that actually matters, something that aligns with who I am at my core." Today, 5 years later, Daniel is a beloved teacher. His students fight to get into his classes. Several of them have told him he changed their lives. His father eventually came around, visiting his classroom one day and seeing firsthand the impact his son was making. And Daniel earns enough to live comfortably, if not lavishly. But more importantly, he wakes up every morning with purpose, with passion, with the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically rather than performing someone else's version of success. This is the lesson of refusing Saul's armor. It's not about being rebellious for the sake of rebellion. It's not about rejecting help or refusing wisdom or isolating yourself from community. It's about having the discernment to know what fits you and what doesn't, what serves your authentic path and what serves someone else's vision for you. It's about having the courage to say, "Thank you for trying to help, but this isn't mine to carry." It's about trusting yourself enough to walk into the valley as exactly who you are, with exactly what you have, refusing to apologize for not being who others expected you to be. David didn't refuse Saul's armor because he was arrogant or foolish. He refused it because he knew himself. He knew what he was capable of. He knew what had worked for him in the past. He knew that his strength didn't come from looking like a warrior, but from being authentically himself. a shepherd with a sling who trusted in something greater than armor could ever provide, and that self-knowledge, that authenticity, that refusal to be anyone other than who he was, that's what made him unstoppable. So here's the question you need to sit with. What armor are you wearing that isn't yours? What expectations are weighing you down? What version of yourself are you performing to please other people? What would it feel like to take it all off, to stand naked before your giant, with nothing but your authentic self and the tools you've actually tested in your own life? It's terrifying to even consider, I know, because the armor provides a sense of security, even if it's false security. The armor makes you feel like you're doing it right, even if right for someone else is wrong for you. But I promise you this, you will never defeat your giant while wearing someone else's armor. You will never fulfill your purpose while trying to live someone else's life. You will never experience the miracle that's waiting for you until you have the courage to show up as exactly who you are. Flaws and all, gifts and all, uniqueness and all. And when you do, when you finally take off the armor and walk into your valley as yourself, that's when everything changes. That's when your real power becomes available. That's when the impossible becomes inevitable. Chapter 6. The Battlefield Within. Before David ever stepped foot in the valley of Elah, before he ever faced Goliath in physical combat, the real battle had already been fought and won. It happened in the invisible realm of his consciousness, in the territory of his beliefs, in the landscape of his inner world where thoughts become things and convictions become reality. This is the secret that most people never understand about transformation. They think the battle is out there, in the circumstances, in the obstacles, in the external challenges. But the truth is far more profound and far more empowering. The real battle is always within. The external giant is nothing more than a physical manifestation of an internal conflict. And the moment you win the war in your mind, the war in your world becomes inevitable. David's real Goliath wasn't the 9-foot warrior standing in the valley. David's real Goliath was the voice in his own head that could have told him he was too small, too young, too inexperienced, too insignificant to face such an overwhelming challenge. That voice existed. It exists in every human being. It's the voice of limitation, the voice of fear, the voice of all the programming you've received since childhood about what's possible and what's not, about who you are and who you're not, about what you deserve and what you don't. But somewhere in those years in the fields, David had learned to silence that voice, or more accurately, he'd learned to replace it with a more powerful voice, a voice of truth, a voice of possibility, a voice that told him he was more than his circumstances suggested, capable of more than his history indicated, destined for more than his current reality reflected. Let me tell you about Catherine. She was a 32-year-old woman who had been in therapy for depression and anxiety for over a decade. She'd tried multiple medications, worked with different therapists, read all the self-help books, attended workshops and retreats. Some things helped temporarily, but nothing created lasting change. She'd have good weeks, followed by crushing weeks. She'd experience moments of hope, followed by long stretches of despair. And underneath all of it was a belief so deep, so fundamental, that she barely even recognized it as a belief. She thought it was just truth. The belief was, I am broken. There is something fundamentally wrong with me that cannot be fixed. This belief wasn't something Catherine had consciously chosen. It had been installed in her neural circuitry through years of experiences and messages. A father who criticized more than he praised. Teachers who overlooked her. Relationships where she was betrayed or abandoned. Each experience added another layer of evidence to support the core belief that she was defective, unworthy, fundamentally flawed. And this belief operated like a filter through which she interpreted every experience in her life. When something good happened, she dismissed it as luck or accident. When something bad happened, she saw it as confirmation of her unworthiness. The belief was running the show, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that kept her trapped in cycles of depression and anxiety, no matter what external interventions she tried. Catherine's breakthrough came not in a therapy session, but in a moment of pure exhaustion. She'd had another terrible week, another relapse into depression, another round of feeling like a failure because she couldn't seem to get better despite all her efforts. She was lying on her bathroom floor at 3 in the morning, crying, when something inside her shifted. A thought appeared in her mind that felt different from all her other thoughts. It said, "What if the belief is wrong? What if you're not broken? What if the only thing wrong with you is that you believe something is wrong with you?" That thought created a crack in the fortress of her limiting belief. And through that crack, Catherine began to see something she'd never seen before. She started to recognize that her depression and anxiety weren't evidence that she was broken. They were evidence that she was trying to live a life built on a foundation of lies about who she was. Her nervous system was in constant stress because there was a war happening inside her between the truth of her inherent worth and the belief in her fundamental unworthiness. The depression wasn't the problem. The belief was the problem. And beliefs, unlike genetic defects or permanent conditions, can be changed. Catherine started working with a new therapist who specialized in belief work and neural reprogramming. Together they began the process of identifying every thread of the limiting belief, tracing it back to its origins, and systematically dismantling it. This wasn't positive thinking. This wasn't just saying affirmations in the mirror. This was deep methodical work of examining evidence, questioning assumptions, and installing new neural pathways based on truth rather than trauma. Catherine started keeping a journal where she wrote evidence that contradicted her core belief. Times when people loved her, accomplishments she'd achieved, moments when she'd been strong. At first her brain resisted this practice. It felt fake, forced, untrue. But she kept doing it anyway, day after day after day. And slowly, something began to shift. Within 6 months, Catherine's depression had lifted in a way it never had before, not because her circumstances changed, but because her relationship with herself changed. The belief, "I am broken," was being replaced with a new belief, "I am whole, worthy, and capable of healing." And from that new belief, everything in her life began to reorganize. She started making different choices. She started attracting different people. She started creating different outcomes. The external world was simply reflecting the internal shift that had taken place in the battlefield of her consciousness. Today, 3 years later, Catherine is off all medications, thriving in her career, in a healthy relationship, and spending her time helping other women recognize and change the limiting beliefs that are running their lives. She told me, the real giant was never depression. The real giant was the belief that created the depression. And once I defeated that giant in my mind, the symptoms in my life had no choice but to disappear. This is the battlefield within. This is where David won his victory before he ever threw a stone. And this is where you must win your victory if you want your external circumstances to change. Because here's what neuroscience has discovered about how beliefs actually work in your brain. Your beliefs are not abstract concepts floating around in your consciousness. They are physical neural networks, pathways that have been carved into your brain through repetition and emotional intensity. Every time you think a thought that aligns with a core belief, you strengthen that pathway. Every time you interpret an experience through the lens of that belief, you reinforce the network. Over time, these pathways become superhighways, automatic programs that run without your conscious awareness, shaping how you perceive reality, how you interpret events, and how you respond to challenges. But here's the empowering part. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new neural pathways, means that you can change these beliefs. You can create new superhighways. You can install new programming. Not instantly, not without effort, but absolutely, definitively, permanently. The process requires you to become aware of the limiting beliefs that are running your life, to question their validity, to seek evidence that contradicts them, and to deliberately and consistently think thoughts and take actions that align with the new beliefs you're choosing to install. This is the work of the battlefield within. This is what transforms your consciousness from a prison of limitation into a palace of possibility. Let me tell you about Vincent. He was a talented musician who had been trying to make it in the industry for 15 years. He'd recorded albums that nobody bought. He'd played shows that nobody attended. He'd sent demos to labels that never responded. Year after year, he kept trying, kept hoping, kept working, but nothing ever seemed to break through. And underneath all his efforts was a belief he didn't even realize he had. Success is for other people, not for me. I'm destined to struggle. This belief had been installed in childhood. His parents had struggled financially his entire life. He'd watched them work hard and never get ahead. He'd internalized the message that some people were lucky and some people weren't. And he was in the category of people who had to work twice as hard for half as much. This belief was sabotaging Vincent in ways he couldn't see. When opportunities came, he'd unconsciously do things that pushed them away. He'd show up late to important meetings. He'd underprice his work. He'd say things that made people question his professionalism. He wasn't doing these things deliberately. His conscious mind wanted success desperately. But his subconscious mind was programmed with a belief that success wasn't for him. And the subconscious always wins the battle between conscious desire and unconscious programming. The subconscious will sabotage any outcome that contradicts its core beliefs, because its primary job is to keep you safe and consistent with your identity, even if that identity is limiting. Vincent's turning point came when a mentor called him out on his self-sabotage. After Vincent showed up late to yet another potentially career-changing meeting, the mentor sat him down and said, "You say you want to succeed, but you behave like someone who's afraid of success. What are you really afraid of?" That question cracked something open in Vincent. He started examining his patterns, his behaviors, his choices, and he began to see the belief that was running underneath everything. The belief that he didn't deserve success, that success would somehow make him different from his family, that if he succeeded where his parents had failed, it would be a betrayal of them. Vincent started the hard work of changing that belief. He worked with a coach who helped him separate his identity from his parents' experiences. He began to understand that his success didn't diminish his parents' worth, that he could honor their struggles while creating a different outcome for himself. He started deliberately acting as if he was someone for whom success was natural and expected. He showed up early to meetings. He priced his work appropriately. He spoke with confidence about his ability. At first, this felt fake, like he was pretending to be someone he wasn't. But he understood that this discomfort was actually a sign that he was challenging the old programming, creating new neural pathways, installing a new operating system. And over time, the new behaviors started to feel natural. The new belief started to feel true. Within 2 years, Vincent's career completely transformed. He signed with a major label. His music started getting radio play. He went on tour, opening for established artists. The external opportunities that had eluded him for 15 years suddenly started flowing to him. But Vincent will tell you that nothing changed externally until everything changed internally. He said, "The industry didn't change. My talent didn't suddenly improve. What changed was my relationship with success. I stopped believing it was for other people and started believing it was for me, too. And the moment that belief shifted in my consciousness, reality reorganized itself to match. This is the power and the necessity of winning the battle within. Your external circumstances are not the cause of your limitations. They are the effect. The cause is always in your consciousness, in the beliefs you hold, in the identity you operate from, in the story you tell yourself about who you are and what's possible for you. And this is simultaneously the most challenging truth to accept and the most liberating truth you'll ever encounter. It's challenging because it means you can't blame your circumstances, your past, your genetics, or other people for where you are. But it's liberating because it means you have the power to change everything by changing what's happening in the invisible realm of your consciousness. Let me tell you about Nicole. She grew up in poverty, in a neighborhood where violence was common and opportunity was rare. She watched friends get pregnant as teenagers, watched brothers and cousins end up in prison, watched her own mother work 3 jobs and still struggle to keep the lights on. Every message she received told her that this was her destiny, too, that escape wasn't possible, that dreaming of something better was just setting yourself up for disappointment. And for the first 25 years of her life, Nicole believed those messages. She worked minimum wage jobs, lived paycheck to paycheck, and accepted that this was just how life was for people like her. But then Nicole had a daughter, and something about holding that tiny baby in her arms awakened something in her that had been dormant. She looked at her daughter and made a decision that changed everything. She decided that her daughter would have opportunities she never had, that the cycle would end with her, that she would create a different reality no matter what it took. But Nicole quickly realized that wanting something different wasn't enough. Her behaviors, her choices, her entire way of operating in the world were all programmed by the beliefs she'd inherited from her environment. If she wanted her external circumstances to change, she had to change her internal programming first. Nicole started with education. She enrolled in community college, taking classes at night after work. But more importantly, she started educating herself about how the mind works, about beliefs and programming and neuroplasticity. She read books about people who had overcome circumstances worse than hers. She listened to podcasts about transformation and success. She surrounded herself with messages that contradicted everything she'd been taught about what was possible for someone from her background. And slowly, painfully, persistently, she began to reprogram her consciousness. The belief "I'm stuck" was being replaced with "I'm capable of creating change." The belief success is for other people was being replaced with "I deserve and can achieve success." The belief "my past determines my future" was being replaced with "my future is determined by my choices today." It took Nicole 6 years to finish her bachelor's degree while working full-time and raising her daughter. But she did it. Then she got a job at a nonprofit, then a better job, then started her own consulting business helping other women from similar backgrounds create economic mobility. Today, 12 years after that decision she made while holding her newborn daughter, Nicole owns her own home, has savings in the bank, and is sending her daughter to a good school. But more importantly, she's broken the cycle. She's proven that the battlefield within is where real transformation happens. She told me, "My circumstances didn't change because I got lucky. or because someone rescued me. My circumstances changed because I declared war on the limiting beliefs that were keeping me trapped. I fought that war every single day in my mind, in my choices, in my actions, and I won. And if I can win that battle, coming from where I came from, anyone can. This is what David understood that the entire army of Israel didn't. The army saw Goliath and believed the giant was more powerful than them. That belief kept them paralyzed in their tents for 40 days. But David saw the same giant and believed something different. He believed that the power working through him was greater than any physical challenge he could face, and because he believed it, because he'd won the battle in his consciousness first, the physical battle was already decided before it began. The throwing of the stone was just the physical manifestation of a victory that had already occurred in the invisible realm of belief and consciousness. So here's the question you need to ask yourself. What beliefs are you holding that are keeping you trapped? What stories are you telling yourself about who you are and what's possible for you? What programming is running in your subconscious that's sabotaging your conscious desires? Because I promise you, your giants exist to reveal those beliefs to you. Every obstacle you face, every challenge that seems insurmountable, every dream that feels impossible, these are all mirrors reflecting back to you the limitations you believe about yourself. And until you address those beliefs, until you win the war within, the war without will continue to rage. You can change your job, change your relationship, change your location. But if you don't change your consciousness, you'll recreate the same patterns in new packaging. The circumstances might look different, but the underlying dynamics will be the same because you're still operating from the same limiting beliefs. But when you do the work, when you enter the battlefield within and begin to systematically identify and dismantle the beliefs that are limiting you, when you start to install new programming based on truth rather than trauma, based on possibility rather than limitation, based on your divine nature rather than your wounded history, everything changes. Not overnight, not without effort, but absolutely definitively, permanently. Your outer world begins to mirror your inner transformation. Opportunities appear that were invisible before. Resources show up that seemed unavailable. Solutions emerge that appeared impossible, not because the external world changed, but because you changed. And reality is always reflecting your consciousness back to you. David walked into that valley having already won the victory in his mind. The stone and the sling were just tools. The real weapon was his consciousness, his unshakable belief that he was aligned with a power greater than any giant, his identity as someone who overcame impossible odds because that's who he was at his core. And you have access to that same weapon. You have the ability to transform your consciousness, to change your beliefs, to reprogram your identity, to win the war within so that the war without becomes nothing more than a formality. The battlefield within is where your freedom lives. It's where your power resides. It's where your transformation begins and ends. And every single day, you get to choose whether you're going to let old limiting beliefs run your life, or whether you're going to install new empowering beliefs that create the future you're meant to live. The choice is yours. The battlefield is waiting, and the victory is available to anyone brave enough to fight for it. Chapter 7. The Run Toward the Impossible. There's a detail in the story of David and Goliath that most people read right past, but it's one of the most significant moments in the entire narrative. When David finally stepped into the valley to face the giant, the text doesn't say he walked toward Goliath. It doesn't say he approached cautiously, or moved carefully, or advanced strategically. It says he ran. David ran toward Goliath. While an entire army had been frozen in fear for 40 days, this young shepherd boy sprinted toward the thing that terrified everyone else. He didn't hesitate. He didn't second guess. He didn't give himself time to reconsider or talk himself out of it. He made his decision, and then he moved with speed, with momentum, with an energy that broadcast to everyone watching that he was absolutely committed to the outcome he'd already chosen in his consciousness. This run toward the impossible is one of the most misunderstood aspects of courage and transformation. People think that courage means you move despite your fear, which is true, but what they miss is the speed component. How fast you move matters just as much as the fact that you move, because hesitation is where dreams die. Hesitation is where momentum gets killed. Hesitation is where your logical mind has time to compile all the reasons why you should play it safe, all the evidence from your past that suggests you're not capable, all the voices of doubt and limitation that will talk you out of the very thing you know you need to do. David understood something profound. Once you've made a true decision, speed becomes your ally. The faster you move toward your giant, the less time fear has to paralyze you. Let me tell you about Richard. He was a 52-year-old corporate executive who'd been dreaming about starting his own business for 20 years. He had notebooks full of ideas, business plans he'd written and rewritten, spreadsheets analyzing every possible scenario. He'd attend conferences and workshops, gather more information, do more research, talk to more experts. He was perpetually preparing, perpetually planning, perpetually on the verge of taking action, but never actually taking it. His friends and family had heard him talk about this dream so many times that they'd stopped taking it seriously. Even Richard had started to wonder if he was the kind of person who talked about doing things but never actually did them. Then something happened that changed everything. Richard's company announced layoffs, and he was on the list. At 52, with a mortgage and 2 kids in college, losing his job should have been devastating. But something unexpected happened in the moment he received the news. Instead of panic, he felt relief. Instead of fear, he felt clarity. The universe had just removed his safety net, and rather than terrifying him, it liberated him. He realized he'd been using his stable corporate job as an excuse not to pursue his dream. As long as he had that job, he could tell himself he'd start his business someday, when the timing was better, when he had more saved, when the kids finished college. But now the decision was being made for him. The job was gone. The timing would never be perfect. It was now or never. Richard did something that shocked everyone who knew him. Instead of immediately starting a job search, instead of updating his resume and networking with other companies, he took his severance package and invested it in his business idea. Within 48 hours of being laid off, he'd registered his company, built a basic website, and reached out to his first potential clients. His wife thought he'd lost his mind. His friends told him he was being reckless. His financial advisor said he should be focused on securing another corporate position. But Richard had spent 20 years hesitating, and he was done. He understood that if he didn't move fast, if he gave himself time to think too much, the fear would creep back in, and he'd end up playing it safe again. So he ran. He ran toward his dream with a speed that left no room for doubt to catch up. The first 6 months were brutal. Richard had no clients, no income, mounting debt, and constant pressure from everyone around him to give up and get a real job. But he kept moving. He made calls. He sent proposals. He showed up to networking events. He refined his offering. He learned from every rejection. And because he was moving with speed and momentum, because he wasn't giving fear time to set up camp in his consciousness, He was able to push through obstacles that would have stopped him if he'd been moving slowly or tentatively. Within 8 months, he landed his first major client. Within a year, he had enough business to hire an assistant. Within 2 years, his company was generating more revenue than his corporate salary had provided. But Richard will tell you that the real victory happened in those first 48 hours when he made the decision to run toward his dream instead of walking away from it. He said, "I'd spent 20 years being careful, being cautious, waiting for the perfect time, and all that caution did was keep me trapped. The moment I started running, the moment I moved with speed and commitment, everything changed. Not because the circumstances got easier, but because momentum has its own power. When you're moving fast towards something, obstacles that seemed insurmountable when you were standing still suddenly become things you can run right through." This is what modern psychology understands about the relationship between action and emotion. Most people wait to feel confident before they take action. They wait to feel ready. They wait to feel certain. But confidence doesn't create action. Action creates confidence. Every time you take a step toward your giant, you're sending a signal to your brain that you're capable, that you're moving forward, that you're someone who acts despite fear. And your brain responds to that signal by releasing neurochemicals that support more action. You build what psychologists call self-efficacy, the belief that you're capable of accomplishing what you set out to do. But this only happens through action. You can't think your way to confidence. You can't plan your way to certainty. You have to move your way there. And the faster you move, the faster the confidence builds. Let me tell you about Melissa. She was a survivor of domestic violence who had finally left her abuser after 8 years of marriage. She'd moved to a new city, changed her phone number, cut ties with anyone who might reveal her location. She was starting over with nothing, sleeping on a friend's couch, working a minimum wage job, trying to rebuild a life from the rubble of everything that had been destroyed. And she was terrified. Terrified that he'd find her. Terrified that she'd made the wrong choice leaving. Terrified that she wouldn't be able to make it on her own. The fear was so intense that some mornings she could barely get out of bed. But Melissa understood something crucial. If she let the fear dictate her pace, if she moved slowly and cautiously, giving herself time to overthink every decision, the fear would consume her. So she made a choice to run. Not physically, but metaphorically. She moved fast. She got up every morning and immediately took action before her mind could spiral into worry. She applied to jobs she wasn't sure she was qualified for. She enrolled in community college classes she wasn't sure she could handle. She joined support groups, even though talking about her trauma was painful. She said yes to opportunities before she felt ready. She made decisions quickly and adjusted course as she went, rather than waiting until she had all the information to make the perfect choice. Within 3 months, Melissa had been promoted at her job. Within 6 months, she'd completed her first semester of college with a 4.0 GPA. Within a year, she'd moved into her own apartment. Within 2 years, she'd graduated and started a career in social work, helping other women leave abusive situations. The transformation was so dramatic that people who met her during this time couldn't believe she was the same person who had been so broken just months before. But Melissa knew the secret. She said, "I didn't wait to feel healed before I started building my new life. I built my new life, and the building of it healed me. I ran toward my future faster than my past could catch me. And every step I took, every risk I took, every time I acted despite the fear, I became a little bit stronger, a little bit more confident, a little bit more certain that I was going to make it. This is the power of momentum. Physics teaches us that an object in motion tends to stay in motion. The same principle applies to human behavior and transformation. When you start moving toward your goals with speed and consistency, you create momentum. And momentum carries you through obstacles that would stop you if you were starting from a standstill. Think about pushing a car that's run out of gas. Getting it moving from a complete stop requires enormous effort. But once it's rolling, once you've built up some momentum, it becomes much easier to keep it going. Your life works the same way. The hardest part is always the initial movement, the decision to start running toward your giant instead of standing still in fear. But once you build momentum, once you're in motion, the obstacles that seemed impossible to overcome become things you push right through without even slowing down. Let me tell you about Antonio. He was a recovering addict who'd been clean for 6 months after a decade of destroying his life with drugs and alcohol. He'd lost his career, his marriage, his home, his relationship with his children. He was living in a halfway house, working a job he hated, trying to navigate early recovery while dealing with overwhelming shame and regret about all the years he'd wasted. His counselor had warned him about the danger of what they called the pink cloud of early recovery, the initial enthusiasm that eventually wears off and leaves you facing the reality of rebuilding a life from nothing. Antonio could feel that pink cloud fading. The initial motivation of getting clean was being replaced by the grinding daily reality of how much he'd lost and how far he had to go. Antonio knew that this was the critical moment. He could either let the weight of what he was facing slow him down, let the enormity of the task paralyze him into relapse, or he could run. He chose to run. He started moving fast toward rebuilding his life. He went back to school, taking night classes while working full-time. He started volunteering at the recovery center where he'd gotten help. He wrote letters to his children every week, even though they weren't ready to see him yet. He attended 12-step meetings daily. He took every opportunity that came his way, said yes to responsibilities before he felt ready, pushed himself to grow faster than felt comfortable. And here's what happened. The momentum he built by moving fast carried him through moments when he wanted to give up. When the cravings hit, when the shame became overwhelming, when the progress seemed too slow, he had momentum on his side. He was in motion. He was building a new life. And it's much harder to stop something that's already in motion than it is to prevent something from starting. Today, 6 years later, Antonio has a successful career as a counselor, helping others in recovery. His children have welcomed him back into their lives. He owns his own home. He's healthy, grounded, and living proof that you can rebuild from nothing if you're willing to move fast enough that your past can't catch you. He told me something I'll never forget. He said, "In early recovery, everyone tells you to take it one day at a time, to go slow, to be patient, and there's wisdom in that. But I also learned that you can't rebuild a life one day at a time if you're moving so slowly that you lose momentum. I needed to run. I needed to move fast. I needed to create so much forward motion that there was no time to look back, no time to doubt, no time for fear to talk me out of the life I was building. The speed of my action was just as important as the action itself." This is what David understood when he ran toward Goliath. He understood that hesitation is the enemy of transformation. He understood that the longer you stand at the edge of the valley looking at your giant, the bigger the giant appears and the smaller you feel. But when you run, when you move with speed and commitment, the giant doesn't have time to grow in your imagination. You're too busy moving, too focused on the action, too committed to the outcome to let fear distract you. And there's something else that happens when you run toward your giant that's almost magical. The people watching, The ones who have been paralyzed by their own fear, they start to get inspired. Your momentum creates a wake that others can ride. Your courage gives others permission to be courageous. Your action proves that action is possible. When the army of Israel saw David running toward Goliath, something shifted in them. For 40 days, they'd been frozen. But watching this shepherd boy sprint toward certain death awakened something in them. It reminded them that they were warriors, not cowards. It showed them that the giant could be faced. And when David's stone found its mark and Goliath fell, the army didn't just celebrate. They charged. They ran into battle themselves, their momentum building on David's momentum, their courage activated by witnessing his courage. One person's willingness to run toward the impossible creates a ripple effect that changes everyone around them. Here's what I need you to understand about your own life and your own giants. You've been standing at the edge of your valley for too long. You've been analyzing, planning, preparing, waiting for the perfect moment, hoping to feel more ready, more capable, more certain. And while you've been standing there, your giant has been growing larger in your imagination. Your fear has been compiling evidence of why you should stay where you are. Your limiting beliefs have been reinforcing their grip on your consciousness. But none of that changes until you run, until you move with speed, until you commit to action so fully that there's no room for doubt to slow you down. I'm not talking about reckless action. I'm not suggesting you move without wisdom or discernment. David ran toward Goliath, but he ran with his stones and his sling. He ran with preparation. He ran with skill. He ran with a plan, but he ran. He didn't walk cautiously. He didn't approach tentatively. He ran. And that speed, that momentum, that absolute commitment to forward motion was part of what made him unstoppable. Because when you're running toward something with your whole being, you become a force that obstacles have to move out of the way for. You become someone who breaks through barriers instead of someone who gets stopped by them. You become the kind of person who transforms impossibilities into inevitabilities through the sheer power of committed action. So here's my question for you. What would it look like for you to run toward your giant instead of tiptoeing toward it? What would change if you moved with speed instead of caution? What would become possible if you acted on your decision immediately instead of giving yourself time to overthink it? What if the thing that's been holding you back isn't lack of resources or lack of preparation, but lack of momentum? What if the answer to your prayers, the solution to your problems, the breakthrough you've been waiting for is on the other side of your willingness to sprint toward the very thing that terrifies you? David's run toward Goliath wasn't just a physical act. It was a declaration. It was a statement to the universe, to the giant, to himself that he was all in, fully committed, absolutely certain of the outcome he'd chosen. And when you move like that, when you run toward your impossible with that level of commitment, reality has no choice but to reorganize itself around your conviction. Doors open, resources appear, solutions emerge, not because the circumstances changed, but because you changed. You went from someone standing still in fear to someone running toward their destiny with unstoppable momentum. And that momentum, that energy, that absolute commitment to forward motion is what turns ordinary people into giant slayers. It's what transforms dreamers into doers. It's what makes miracles not just possible, but inevitable. So stop standing at the edge of your valley. Stop giving fear time to talk you out of your calling. Stop waiting for perfect conditions that will never come. Make your decision. Pick up your stones and run. Run like your life depends on it, because it does. Chapter 8. The Stone the target, and divine precision. In all the drama of David running toward Goliath, in all the courage it took to face the giant, there's a moment that often gets overlooked, but contains one of the most profound lessons about how manifestation actually works. David reached into his bag, selected one stone from the 5 he'd carefully chosen, placed it in his sling, and let it fly. One stone, one shot, one absolutely precise strike that hit Goliath in the only vulnerable spot on his entire body, the small gap between his helmet and his armor, right in the center of his forehead. This wasn't luck. This wasn't random chance. This wasn't a desperate throw that happened to connect. This was precision. This was clarity. This was the physical manifestation of a consciousness that knew exactly what it wanted and exactly how to achieve it. Think about what this means. David didn't throw multiple stones hoping one would hit. He didn't spray projectiles in Goliath's general direction and hope for the best. He aimed at a specific target, a target so small that missing it by inches would have meant certain death, and he hit it perfectly. This level of precision reveals something critical about how transformation works, about how you move from where you are to where you want to be, about how you turn intention into reality. Vague desires create vague results. General wishes create general outcome. But absolute clarity, precise focus, unwavering intention aimed at a specific target, that creates miracles. That creates the impossible. That creates outcomes so exact, so perfect, so aligned with your vision that they can only be explained as the result of consciousness directing energy with surgical precision. Let me tell you about Margaret. She was a single mother of 2 who had been struggling financially for years, working multiple jobs just to keep her family afloat, drowning in debt, feeling like she was running as fast as she could, but never getting anywhere. She'd tried affirmations, vision boards, positive thinking, all the manifestation techniques that people talk about. She'd wished for things to get better, hoped for a miracle, prayed for help. But nothing changed. Her financial situation remained desperate. Her stress remained overwhelming. Her future remained uncertain, and she couldn't understand why. She was doing everything the books and videos told her to do. She was thinking positively. She was visualizing. She was affirming. But none of it was working. Then Margaret attended a workshop where the facilitator asked a question that changed everything for her. The facilitator said, "What exactly do you want? Not generally, not vaguely, but exactly. What specific outcome are you trying to create?" Margaret started to answer with her usual response about wanting financial freedom and abundance, but the facilitator stopped her. "Those are concepts, not targets. Financial freedom means something different to everyone. Abundance is relative. What specifically do you need to happen in your life for you to feel free and abundant? What's the exact dollar amount? What's the exact debt you need to eliminate? What's the exact income you need to generate? You can't hit a target you can't see. You can't manifest what you can't clearly define." This question forced Margaret to get more honest and specific than she'd ever been. She went home and did the math. She calculated exactly how much money she needed per month to cover her basic expenses, pay down her debt, and have a small cushion for emergencies. The number was $3,800 per month after taxes. That was her target. Not more money or financial abundance, but $3,800 per month. She wrote it down. She looked at it every day. She started asking herself not, "How can I attract abundance?" but, "What specific actions can I take that will generate $3,800 per month?" This shift from vague desire to precise target changed everything. Margaret's brain now had something concrete to work with. Instead of spinning in generalities about abundance and manifestation, Her mind could now focus on solving a specific problem. She started seeing opportunities she'd been blind to before. She realized that her current jobs were never going to get her to that number. So she needed to do something different. She started researching higher-paying careers that she could break into without a 4-year degree. She discovered medical billing and coding, which could be learned through a certification program. She enrolled in an online course, studied during every spare moment, completed it in 6 months, and got certified. Within 2 months of certification, she had a job that paid exactly $3,800 per month after taxes. But here's what Margaret told me that reveals the deeper truth about precision and manifestation. She said, "It wasn't the number itself that created the change. It was the clarity the number gave me. When I had a specific target, my brain could calculate the exact steps needed to reach it. When I only had vague desires, my brain didn't know what to do with them. The universe responds to precision. God responds to clarity. Your subconscious responds to specific instruction. You cannot manifest what you cannot clearly define. The moment I knew exactly what I needed, the path to getting it became visible. It was there the whole time, but I couldn't see it because I didn't know what I was looking for." This is what quantum physics has been trying to tell us about how consciousness creates reality. At the quantum level, infinite possibilities exist in what's called superposition, a state where all potential outcomes exist simultaneously until an observer collapses those possibilities into a specific reality through the act of observation. Your attention, your focus, your consciousness acts as the observer that collapses infinite possibility into singular actuality. But here's the key. You can't collapse possibility into specificity if you're not specific about what you want. Vague observation creates vague results, but precise observation, laser-focused intention, aimed at an exact outcome that collapses the quantum field into the exact reality you're focused on. Let me tell you about James. He was a writer who had been trying to get a book published for 10 years. He'd written 3 complete manuscripts, sent hundreds of query letters to agents and publishers, collected enough rejection letters to wallpaper a room. He kept telling himself and everyone else that he wanted to be a published author. But his mentor, another writer who had achieved success, asked him a question that stopped him cold. What kind of published author do you want to be? There are millions of published authors, and most of them are unknown and barely making any money. Is that what you want? Or do you want something specific? James realized he'd never actually defined what success as an author meant to him. He'd been aiming at a vague target called being published, without ever getting clear on what that actually looked like. Did he want to be published by a major traditional publisher, or would indie publishing satisfy him? Did he want to write literary fiction or commercial fiction? Did he want critical acclaim or commercial success? Did he want to reach a mass audience or a niche audience? All of these required completely different strategies, different approaches, different actions. But because he'd never been clear about what he actually wanted, he'd been taking scattered, unfocused action that led nowhere. James spent a week getting brutally honest with himself about what he really wanted. And what emerged was surprisingly specific. He wanted to write thriller novels that were published by one of the big 5 publishing houses, that sold at least 50,000 copies in the first year, that earned him enough in advances and royalties to write full-time. That was his target, not just being a published author, but that specific version of success. Once he had that clarity, everything changed. He stopped sending manuscripts of his literary fiction to agents who represented commercial fiction. He stopped trying to write the kind of books that would impress critics and started writing the kind of books that thriller readers actually wanted to read. He studied the top-selling thrillers to understand what made them work. He rewrote his manuscript with this specific target in mind. Within 6 months, James had an agent. Within a year, he had a 2-book deal with a major publisher. Within 2 years, his first book had sold 65,000 copies. He'd hit his target almost exactly. And James told me that the books he wrote after getting clear on his target weren't necessarily better written than the ones before. What changed was his focus. He said, "I'd been throwing stones in the general direction of being an author and wondering why none of them hit anything meaningful. But when I identified my exact target, when I knew precisely what I was aiming for, suddenly I could see the path to get there. The target didn't change what was possible. It changed what I could see, and therefore what actions I could take. This principle applies to every area of life. You want better health? Define exactly what that means. What weight do you want to be? What specific health markers do you want to improve? What exactly do you want to be able to do physically that you can't do now? You want a better relationship? Define exactly what that looks like. What specific qualities matter to you in a partner? What kind of connection are you seeking? What would a day in that relationship actually look like? You want career success? Define exactly what success means to you. What position? What income? What kind of work? What kind of impact? The more specific you are, the more precisely your consciousness can aim at the target, and the more accurately you'll hit it. Let me tell you about Sandra. She'd been unhappy in her marriage for years, but stayed because she was afraid of being alone, afraid of what divorce would do to her kids, afraid of the financial implications. She told herself she wanted to be happy, wanted things to be better, wanted her husband to change. But nothing ever changed because wanting to be happy isn't a target. It's a wish. Her therapist asked her to get specific about what would need to change for her to feel the marriage was working. Sandra started making a list. She needed her husband to attend couples therapy consistently. She needed him to take responsibility for his anger issues instead of blaming her for triggering them. She needed him to be involved with the kids, not just present in the house. She needed to feel respected, heard, valued. She wrote down 12 specific, measurable behaviors that would indicate to her that the marriage was worth saving. Then her therapist had her do something that felt almost cruel at the time, but turned out to be essential. The therapist said, "Now rate your husband on each of these 12 things right now. Be honest. How is he actually doing on these specific measures?" Sandra rated him honestly. He was meeting 2 of the 12 criteria, 2 out of 12. Seeing it written down like that, seeing the specific, measurable gap between what she needed and what she was getting, brought devastating clarity. She'd been living in a fog of hope and fear, telling herself vague stories about how things could get better. But the numbers didn't lie. She needed 12 things. He was providing 2. That was her reality. Sandra took that list to her husband. She told him these were the specific changes she needed to see within 6 months, or she would file for divorce. It wasn't a threat. It was clarity. For the first time in their marriage, she wasn't being vague about her unhappiness. She was giving him an exact target to aim for. And something interesting happened. Her husband, faced with specific, clear expectations instead of general complaints, actually started trying. He started therapy. He started working on his anger. He started being more present with the kids. 6 months later, when Sandra evaluated him again on her 12 criteria, he was meeting 8 of them. Not perfect, but a massive improvement. And more importantly, she could see that he was genuinely trying, genuinely changing, genuinely committed to hitting the targets she'd set. Today, 5 years later, their marriage isn't perfect, but it works. He's meeting 10 of her 12 criteria most of the time, and they've learned to communicate with specificity instead of in vague complaints and wishes. Sandra told me that getting specific saved her marriage, not because the specificity forced her husband to change, but because it gave both of them something concrete to work toward. She said, "I'd been throwing stones at the general problem of our marriage isn't working for years, and nothing hit. But when I identified 12 specific targets, when I knew exactly what needed to change, suddenly change became possible. You can't fix what you can't define. You can't improve what you can't measure. Precision isn't just about manifestation, it's about transformation. This is what David's stone hitting Goliath's forehead represents. It's the power of absolute clarity combined with absolute commitment. David knew exactly where he needed to hit. He'd probably practiced that exact shot hundreds of times on wild animals threatening his sheep. His muscle memory knew the weight of the stone, the tension in the sling, the arc of the throw, the exact release point that would send the projectile to its target. When he let that stone fly, there was no hesitation, no doubt, no second-guessing. His body executed what his mind had already accomplished in consciousness. The physical outcome was just the manifestation of the internal precision I'd cultivated. Here's what neuroscience tells us about how this works in your brain. When you have a vague goal like, "I want to be successful," or "I want to be happy," your brain doesn't know how to process that. These concepts are too abstract, too subjective, too undefined to create specific neural activation patterns. But when you have a precise target, when you can visualize the exact outcome you want in specific, sensory detail, your brain lights up with activity. Your reticular activating system, the part of your brain that filters information and determines what you pay attention to, programs itself to notice anything relevant to your specific target. Your prefrontal cortex starts working on problem-solving and strategy. Your hippocampus begins consolidating memories and experiences that relate to achieving that target. Your entire neurology organizes itself around the precise outcome you've defined. But there's more. When you combine precision with emotion, when you not only know exactly what you want, but also feel deeply connected to why you want it, you activate your limbic system, the emotional center of your brain. This creates what neuroscientists call emotional tagging, where memories and information related to your goal get marked as important. This makes them easier to recall, more likely to influence your decisions, more powerful in shaping your behavior. David didn't just know he needed to hit Goliath in the forehead. He felt in every cell of his body why it mattered. His people's freedom depended on it. God's reputation was at stake. His own destiny was being written in that moment. The precision of his target was amplified by the intensity of his emotion, and that combination made the outcome inevitable. Let me tell you about Trevor. He was overweight, unhealthy, and tired of feeling terrible in his own body. He'd tried to lose weight dozens of times, starting and stopping various diets and exercise programs. Each time, he'd tell himself he wanted to get healthy or lose weight. But those vague goals never lasted more than a few weeks before he'd slide back into old patterns. Then Trevor hired a trainer who took a completely different approach. The trainer said, "Forget about losing weight or getting healthy. Those are too vague. Tell me exactly what you want to be able to do with your body that you can't do now." Trevor thought about it and realized what he really wanted was to hike to the top of a specific mountain near his home with his teenage son. It was a challenging hike, about 8 miles round trip with significant elevation gain. Trevor had tried it once 3 years ago and had to turn back halfway up, humiliated and gasping for breath, while his son finished it easily. That failure had haunted him. So his target became hike to the summit of that mountain with his son 6 months from now. That was it. Not lose 50 pounds or get in shape. Hike that specific mountain on a specific date. Everything changed with that precision. The trainer designed a program specifically to prepare Trevor for that hike. They trained on stairs, built his cardiovascular endurance, strengthened his legs and core. Trevor had a countdown on his phone. Every workout, every food choice, every moment he wanted to quit, he thought about that mountain. He visualized standing at the summit with his son. He felt the emotion of redemption, of proving to himself that he could do what he'd failed at before. The target was so specific, so clear, so emotionally charged, that staying committed became easier than giving up. 6 months later, Trevor and his son reached the summit together. Trevor cried at the top, not because of the physical accomplishment, though that was significant. He'd lost 42 pounds and gained strength he hadn't had in decades, but he cried because he'd proven something to himself about the power of precision. He'd hit his target exactly, and that precision, that clarity, that specific vision had carried him through 6 months of hard work that vague goals about getting healthy had never sustained. Trevor told me the mountain was just a mountain, but having that specific target, knowing exactly what I was working toward, feeling connected to why it mattered, that's what made the impossible possible. That's what turned wishful thinking into actual transformation. This is your invitation to precision. Stop throwing stones at vague targets and wondering why nothing's hitting. Stop wishing for general improvements and hoping something changes. Stop aiming at concepts like success, happiness, abundance, health, or love without defining exactly what those words mean to you in specific, measurable, observable terms. Get brutally clear. What exactly do you want? When exactly do you want it? What will you see, hear, feel, experience when you have it? What are the specific, measurable indicators that will tell you you've achieved it? David's stone found Goliath's forehead because David knew exactly where he was aiming and had practiced hitting that exact kind of target thousands of times. Your stone will find its target when you stop being vague about what you want and get absolutely precise about the outcome you're creating. The universe cannot deliver what you cannot clearly request. God cannot manifest what you cannot specifically envision. Your subconscious cannot create what you cannot precisely define. But when you know your target, when you aim with clarity, when you focus with intensity, when you release your intention with unwavering conviction, your stone will fly true, and the giant that seemed invincible will fall from a single, perfectly placed strike. That's not magic. That's not luck. That's the natural result of precision meeting preparation, meeting courage. That's how miracles work. That's how the impossible becomes inevitable. One stone, one target, one perfect strike. Chapter 9. When the giant awls. The stone left David's sling and flew through the air in what must have felt like slow motion to everyone watching. For 40 days, this giant had stood in that valley, unconquered, untouchable, seemingly invincible, and now, in a single moment that defied all logic and expectation, the impossible was happening. The stone struck Goliath exactly where David had aimed, and the massive warrior staggered. His eyes went blank, his knees buckled, and then, like a tower that had stood for centuries, suddenly losing its foundation, Goliath fell. The sound of his armored body hitting the ground must have echoed through the entire valley. The Philistine army, which had been so confident just moments before, stood frozen in shock. The Israelite army, which had been paralyzed by fear for weeks, suddenly erupted with a roar of victory, and David, the shepherd boy who everyone had dismissed, stood over the fallen giant, no longer the underdog, but the victor. But here's what most people miss about this moment. The falling of the giant wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of everything that came after. Because what happens in the moment of your victory, what you do with that breakthrough, how you integrate that transformation, that determines whether you're someone who had one good moment or someone who became fundamentally different. Too many people defeat their giant and then immediately sabotage the victory. They achieve the breakthrough, and then their old patterns, old beliefs, old identity reasserts itself and pulls them back to where they started. The giant falls, but if you don't know how to handle the moment when it falls, you'll find yourself facing that same giant again, or a different giant that's really just the same giant in a new form. Let me tell you about Christine. She spent 20 years building a successful career in finance, climbing the corporate ladder, achieving every marker of professional success. But she was miserable. She drank too much to cope with the stress. Her marriage was falling apart. She barely saw her kids. Her health was deteriorating. She knew something had to change, but the golden handcuffs of her salary and status kept her trapped. Then one day, her company announced massive layoffs, and she was on the list. The thing she'd feared for years had happened. She lost the job that had defined her identity, the income that had sustained her lifestyle, the status that had given her worth in her own eyes. For the first 3 months, Christine fell apart. She drank more. She isolated herself. She spiraled into depression. But then something shifted. She realized that losing her job, as devastating as it felt, had actually freed her. The giant of corporate success that had been crushing her life had finally fallen. She had a choice in this moment. She could either try to resurrect that giant, find another corporate job, rebuild the same life that had been killing her, or she could accept that the giant was dead and use this moment to become someone new. She chose transformation. Christine used her severance to pay for treatment for her alcohol dependence. She started therapy to address the underlying issues that had driven her addiction. She spent time with her kids for the first time in years, actually present instead of just physically there but mentally at work. She reconnected with her husband and they started rebuilding their marriage. She took a job that paid half what she'd been making, but gave her a reasonable schedule and work that felt meaningful. And she started the process of building a new identity, not based on job title or income or status, but based on being a whole person, a present mother, a connected partner, a healthy human being. But here's what Christine told me about those first 6 months after her giant fell. She said, "The hardest part wasn't losing the job. The hardest part was resisting the urge to immediately find another job just like it. Every instinct in me wanted to prove that I could get back to where I'd been, that the layoff was just a temporary setback. I had recruiters calling me with offers for similar positions at other companies. I could have been back in that world within a month, but I knew that if I did that, I'd be resurrecting the very giant that had finally been defeated. The victory wasn't just about the giant falling. The victory was about letting it stay fallen and building a new life on the foundation of its defeat. This is the critical moment that determines whether transformation is temporary or permanent. When your giant falls, there's a window of opportunity where everything is fluid, where your old identity has been disrupted, but your new identity hasn't fully formed yet. In that window, you're vulnerable to 2 opposing forces. One force is trying to pull you back to who you were, to resurrect the familiar patterns even if they were destructive, because the known is always more comfortable than the unknown. The other force is inviting you forward into a new version of yourself, but that requires you to sit in the discomfort of not knowing who you are anymore, of being in transition, of allowing the old you to die completely so the new you can emerge. Let me tell you about Marcus. He was 350 pounds and had been obese his entire adult life. He'd tried every diet, every program, Every quick fix. He'd lose some weight, feel good for a while, then gain it all back, plus more. The cycle had repeated so many times that he'd stopped believing change was possible. Then Marcus had a health scare. His doctor told him that his blood pressure and cholesterol were at levels that meant he was at serious risk for a heart attack or stroke. The doctor was blunt. Change or die. That was the choice. Marcus finally got serious. He hired a trainer, started working out 6 days a week, completely changed how he ate. It was brutal. Every day was a battle. But he kept showing up, kept pushing through the discomfort, kept choosing his new life over his old patterns. 12 months later, Marcus had lost 140 pounds. He was in the best shape of his life. His health markers were all normal. His doctor called him a miracle. Everyone who knew him was amazed by the transformation. The giant of obesity that had ruled his life for decades had finally fallen. But then something dangerous started happening. Marcus started relaxing. He'd achieved his goal weight, so he thought he could ease up on the intensity. He started skipping workouts here and there. He started eating things he'd eliminated, telling himself he'd earned the right to indulge occasionally. Within 3 months, he'd gained back 20 pounds. Within 6 months, 40 pounds. The old patterns were reasserting themselves. The giant was trying to resurrect, and Marcus was terrified because he could feel himself sliding back into the person he'd worked so hard to stop being. Marcus's trainer saw what was happening and had a crucial conversation with him. The trainer said, "You're treating your transformation like it was a destination you reached. You lost the weight, so you thought you were done. But transformation isn't a destination. It's a new way of being that has to be maintained every single day. The giant didn't fall, so you could go back to your old life. The giant fell, so you could live a new life. And living that new life requires you to be vigilant, to protect the victory, to never assume you can go back to old patterns without consequences." That conversation woke Marcus up. He realized he'd been treating his health transformation like a temporary project instead of a permanent identity shift. He wasn't someone who used to be obese and lost weight. He was someone who had become healthy, and being healthy required ongoing commitment. He got back to his workout routine, not as punishment, but as a non-negotiable part of who he was now. He went back to eating in a way that honored his body, not as a diet, but as how he lived. And crucially, he started working with a therapist to address the emotional issues that had driven his obesity in the first place, understanding that if he didn't heal the internal wounds, the external symptoms would keep trying to return. Today, 4 years later, Marcus has maintained his weight loss. But more importantly, he's maintained his transformation. He told me, "I used to think that defeating the giant was the hard part, but I learned that keeping the giant defeated is actually harder. Because your old patterns don't just disappear. They wait for you to let your guard down. They wait for you to think you've won and can relax. The real victory isn't in the moment the giant falls. The real victory is in choosing every single day to be the person who defeated the giant, rather than reverting to the person who lived under the giant's shadow." This is what the story of David teaches us about the moment after victory. After Goliath fell, David didn't just walk away. He went over to the giant's body, took Goliath's own sword, and cut off his head. This might seem brutal or excessive, but it's deeply symbolic. David was making sure the giant was completely, definitively, permanently dead. He was ensuring there would be no resurrection, no comeback, no possibility of that threat returning. And then he took the giant's head with him, kept it as evidence of what had been accomplished, as a reminder of the victory, as proof that what seemed impossible had become reality. You need to do the same thing with your giants. When your giant falls, when you achieve that breakthrough, When you finally overcome that obstacle that's been dominating your life, you need to make sure it's completely dead. You need to cut off its head, and that means identifying and eliminating the root causes that created the giant in the first place. If your giant is debt, and you finally pay it off, you need to address the spending habits and money beliefs that created the debt. If your giant is a toxic relationship, and you finally leave, you need to heal the wounds and patterns that attracted that relationship. If your giant is an addiction, and you finally get sober, you need to address the pain and trauma that drove the addiction. The external giant falling is just the beginning. The real work is killing it at the root, so it never grows back. Let me tell you about Veronica. She was in an emotionally abusive relationship for 7 years. Her partner was manipulative, controlling, gaslighting her constantly, destroying her self-esteem piece by piece. She tried to leave multiple times, but always got pulled back in by his promises to change, his threats of what he'd do if she left, her own fear of being alone. Finally, after he crossed a line that she couldn't uncross, she found the strength to leave for good. She moved to a different city, blocked him on everything, cut off all contact. The giant of that toxic relationship had finally fallen. But 6 months later, Veronica found herself attracted to someone new. And as the relationship developed, she started noticing patterns that terrified her. This new person wasn't as overtly abusive as her ex, but there were subtle signs of controlling behavior, manipulation, boundary violations. She was being drawn to the same dynamic, just in a different package. The giant hadn't really fallen. It had just shape-shifted. Because Veronica had left the relationship, but she hadn't healed the part of her that attracted and tolerated that kind of treatment. The external giant was gone, but the internal pattern was still running. Veronica made a crucial decision. She ended the new relationship, even though part of her wanted to ignore the red flags and hope it would be different. And she committed to intensive therapy to understand why she kept finding herself in these dynamics. She started exploring her childhood wounds, the messages she'd received about love and worth, the beliefs she held about what she deserved. She did the hard, uncomfortable work of healing the root causes, not just treating the symptoms. It took 2 years of deep internal work before Veronica felt ready to date again. And when she did, something was different. She found herself attracted to people who were healthy, who respected boundaries, who treated her well. And when someone showed even subtle signs of the old patterns, she felt it immediately and had the strength to walk away without hesitation. Veronica told me, "Leaving my ex was the easy part, even though it felt impossible at the time. The hard part was killing the pattern inside me that had attracted him in the first place. If I hadn't done that work, I would have just kept recreating the same relationship with different people. The giant would have kept resurrecting in new forms. Real freedom didn't come from leaving the relationship. It came from becoming someone who would never tolerate that kind of relationship again. This is the deepest truth about the moment when your giant falls. The external victory is meaningless if it's not accompanied by internal transformation. You can lose the weight, but if you don't change your relationship with food and your body, you'll gain it back. You can leave the toxic job, but if you don't address the patterns that kept you there, you'll end up in another toxic job. You can pay off the debt, but if you don't heal your relationship with money, you'll create more debt. The giant falling is just the beginning. The real work is becoming someone who no longer needs that giant in their life, someone who has healed the wounds that created space for the giant, someone who has transformed at such a fundamental level that the giant can never return. Here's what neuroscience tells us about why this matters. Your brain has what's called a homeostatic impulse, a drive to maintain stability and return to familiar patterns even when those patterns are destructive. When you change too quickly or too dramatically, your brain perceives it as a threat to your survival and activates mechanisms to pull you back to baseline. This is why people who win the lottery often end up broke again. Why people who lose weight rapidly often gain it back. Why people who make dramatic life changes often slide back to their old patterns. The external circumstances changed, but the internal identity didn't. And your brain always works to bring your external reality back into alignment with your internal identity. The way to overcome this homeostatic impulse is through integration. When your giant falls, you need to consciously, deliberately, consistently reinforce your new identity. You need to tell yourself the story of who you are now, not who you used to be. You need to make choices every day that align with your transformed self, not your old self. You need to surround yourself with people and environments that support your new identity, not ones that reinforce your old identity. And you need to give yourself time to stabilize in your new state before you relax your vigilance. This isn't about living in fear that you'll backslide. It's about understanding that transformation requires maintenance, that freedom requires protection, that the victory needs to be defended until it becomes your new normal. David understood this. After he defeated Goliath, he didn't go back to being a shepherd. He couldn't. That identity was dead. The boy who tended sheep had become the man who killed giants, and he lived from that new identity for the rest of his life. Every decision he made, every battle he fought, every challenge he faced was informed by the knowing that he was someone who had defeated the impossible. The falling of Goliath wasn't a one-time event. It was the birth of a new David, and that David spent the rest of his life honoring the transformation that moment created. So when your giant falls, and it will fall, when you achieve that breakthrough you've been working toward, when you overcome that obstacle that's been defining your life, don't just celebrate and move on. Pause, recognize the magnitude of what just happened. Cut off the giant's head by addressing the root causes that created it. Carry the evidence of your victory with you as a reminder of what you're capable of. Protect your transformation by making choices every day that align with who you've become, not who you used to be. And understand that the moment the giant falls is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of a new chapter, written by a new you, living from a new identity, creating from a new level of consciousness. The giant has fallen. Now the question is, who will you be in the world where that giant no longer exists? Answer that question with intention, with consciousness, with commitment, because your answer will determine whether this victory is permanent or temporary, whether this transformation is real or illusory, whether you're truly free or just enjoying a brief respite before the giant resurrects in a new form. Choose wisely. Choose consciously. Choose to become someone for whom that giant can never return. Chapter 10. From Shepherd to King. Your new identity. David didn't return to the fields after he defeated Goliath. He couldn't. The moment that stone left his hand and found its mark, the moment the giant fell and the army erupted in victory, the moment King Saul called him forward and the nation began to see him differently, something irreversible happened. David the shepherd ceased to exist, not because he rejected that part of his story, but because he had evolved beyond it. He had stepped into a new identity, one that had been waiting for him all along, one that could only be activated by his willingness to face the impossible. And from that day forward, every step he took was leading him toward a throne, toward kingship, toward a destiny that was far greater than anything he could have imagined while watching sheep in those quiet fields. This is the ultimate truth about facing your giant. The victory isn't really about defeating the obstacle. It's about who you become in the process. It's about the identity transformation that occurs when you choose courage over comfort, when you step into the valley despite your fear, when you aim with precision and act with commitment. The giant is just the catalyst. The real miracle is the metamorphosis that happens within you. The shift from seeing yourself as small and limited to recognizing yourself as powerful and infinite. The evolution from someone who is defined by their circumstances to someone who defines their circumstances through the force of their consciousness. Let me tell you about Elizabeth. She grew up in extreme poverty, the daughter of addicts who were rarely present and never supportive. By the time she was 16, she was living on the streets, surviving through a combination of minimum wage jobs and the charity of strangers. Everyone who knew her story looked at her with pity. The unspoken message was clear. With a start like that, she'd be lucky to just survive, to make it to adulthood without becoming another tragic statistic. And for years, Elizabeth believed that narrative. She saw herself as damaged, limited, destined for a small life, because that's what her circumstances had taught her she was worth. But something shifted in Elizabeth when she was 23. She was working at a coffee shop, serving a woman who was clearly successful, confident, put together in a way that Elizabeth had never felt. And this woman did something unexpected. She looked Elizabeth in the eyes and said, "You have something special about you. I don't know what it is, but I can see it. Don't let this job be your ceiling. You're meant for more." That one comment, that one moment of being seen differently than she saw herself, cracked something open in Elizabeth. She went home that night and asked herself a question she'd never dared to ask before. What if my past doesn't determine my future? What if I'm not who I've been told I am? That question was Elizabeth's decision to step into the valley. Her giant was the identity of poverty, limitation, and unworthiness that had been imposed on her by circumstances and reinforced by years of believing she was less than. Facing that giant meant challenging every belief she'd held about who she was and what was possible for her. It meant enrolling in community college despite having barely graduated high school. It meant applying for scholarships and grants, even though she felt like an imposter. It meant studying in the only quiet place she could find, a 24-hour diner, because her apartment was too chaotic. It meant showing up to class exhausted from working full-time, determined to prove to herself that she was capable of more than survival. The first semester was brutal. Elizabeth failed 2 classes and barely passed the others. Every failure felt like confirmation that she'd been right to doubt herself, that she was foolish to think she could rise above her circumstances, but something in her refused to quit. She got a tutor. She adjusted her work schedule. She learned how to study. And slowly, painfully, she started to succeed. Not just academically, but internally. With each class she passed, each paper she wrote, each test she studied for, she was building evidence for a new identity. She was becoming someone who was educated, capable, worthy of opportunity. The external achievements were just reflections of the internal transformation. 4 years later, Elizabeth graduated with honors and a degree in social work. But the real transformation wasn't the degree. It was who she had become in the process of earning it. She was no longer the girl from the streets who felt lucky to survive. She was a woman who had faced the impossible and won, who had challenged every limiting belief and proven them wrong, who had looked at a giant of systemic poverty and personal trauma and said, "You don't get to define me anymore." Today, 12 years after that conversation in the coffee shop, Elizabeth runs a nonprofit that helps young people experiencing homelessness access education and opportunity. She's married, owns a home, has 2 children who will grow up knowing they can become anything. But when I asked her what she's most proud of, she didn't mention any of those external achievements. She said, "I'm most proud that I'm teaching my children a different truth than the one I was taught. I'm showing them that who you are is not determined by where you come from, that your identity is not fixed by your circumstance, that you can face the impossible and become someone entirely new in the process." This is the journey from shepherd to king. It's the evolution from a limited identity based on circumstances to an empowered identity based on consciousness. David didn't become king immediately after defeating Goliath. He spent years being hunted by Saul, living in caves, leading a ragtag group of outcasts, facing challenge after challenge that could have broken him. But through all of it, he was becoming. He was evolving. He was growing into the identity that the moment with Goliath had activated. And when he finally sat on the throne, it wasn't a surprise or an accident. It was the inevitable culmination of the person he'd been becoming since the day he ran toward that giant. Let me tell you about Michael. He was a middle manager at a corporation, comfortable but unfulfilled, playing it safe, never risking, never challenging himself, coasting on mediocrity. He told himself he was content, but inside he felt dead. And then Michael's company brought in a new CEO who implemented massive changes. Michael was given a choice: step up into a leadership role that was far beyond his current capabilities, or step aside and let someone else take it. The safe choice was obvious. He wasn't qualified for the bigger role. He'd never led at that level. He could easily justify staying in his comfortable position. But something in Michael couldn't say no. Despite all his logical reasons to play it safe, he heard himself accepting the challenge. The first 6 months were a disaster. Michael was in over his head. He made mistakes that cost the company money. He struggled to lead people who had more experience than him. He went home every night convinced he was about to be fired. But here's what Michael discovered. Being pushed beyond your capacity is how you expand your capacity. The identity that was comfortable managing a small team couldn't handle leading a division. So that identity had to die, and in its place, a new identity had to emerge. Michael started reading everything he could about leadership. He hired an executive coach. He asked for feedback, even when it was painful. He made himself vulnerable enough to admit what he didn't know. And most importantly, he started seeing himself differently, not as a middle manager pretending to be a leader, but as a leader who was still learning his craft. 3 years later, Michael was promoted to VP. 5 years later, he was offered a CEO position at a different company. Today, he leads an organization of 5,000 people. But Michael will tell you that the transformation didn't happen because he learned new skills or acquired new knowledge. It happened because he allowed his identity to evolve. He said, "The giant I faced wasn't the challenge of the bigger role. The giant was my belief that I was just a middle manager, that I'd reached my ceiling, that playing it safe was the smart choice. Defeating that giant meant becoming someone new. And once I became that person, the opportunities that seemed impossible before became inevitable." This is what happens when you defeat your giants. You don't just solve a problem. You become someone new. You evolve to a level of consciousness that makes the old problems irrelevant. You step into an identity that operates from a completely different paradigm. And from that new identity, you create a completely different reality. This isn't just about positive thinking or mindset shifts. This is about fundamental transformation at the level of who you are, how you see yourself, what you believe is possible for you. This is about death and resurrection. The old you has to die so the new you can live. Let me tell you about Janice. She was diagnosed with a chronic illness that doctors told her she'd have to manage for the rest of her life. They gave her medications, lifestyle recommendations, coping strategy. The message was clear: you'll never be fully healthy again, so learn to live with limitation. And for 2 years, Janice accepted that identity. She was a sick person, managing her illness, grateful for any day that wasn't completely terrible. She organized her entire life around her limitations. She turned down opportunities because they seemed too demanding for someone in her condition. She let relationships fade because she didn't have energy to maintain them. She became smaller and smaller, defining herself more and more by what she couldn't do. But then Janice read a book about people who had healed from supposedly incurable conditions, not through magic or miracles, but through addressing the emotional and psychological factors that contributed to their illness. And something clicked for her. She realized she'd been so focused on managing her symptoms that she'd never questioned the identity of being a sick person. She'd accepted the limitation as permanent truth, rather than seeing it as a current reality that could be transformed. So Janice started doing the work. She went to therapy to address childhood trauma she'd never dealt with. She started meditating to calm her nervous system. She changed how she ate, not just following medical advice, but really listening to her body. She began moving again, gently at first, building strength slowly. But most importantly, she started seeing herself differently, not as a sick person trying to cope, but as a whole person who was healing. The changes didn't happen overnight. It took months before she noticed improvements. It took a year before she could reduce her medications. It took 2 years before her doctors were looking at her test results in confusion, unable to explain how someone with her diagnosis could have such dramatically improved markers. Today, 5 years later, Janice is healthier than she's been in decades. She's off all medications. She works full-time, travels, lives without the limitations that once defined her existence. And she'll tell you that the healing wasn't just physical. She said, the illness was real, the symptoms were real, but the identity of being sick was what kept me sick. The moment I decided I was someone who was healing, rather than someone who was sick, everything changed. Not immediately, not magically, but definitively. The giant of chronic illness fell because I stopped being someone who lived under that giant's shadow and became someone who refused to let illness define me. This is the power of identity transformation. Your current identity is creating your current reality. Not partially, completely. The person you believe yourself to be determines what opportunities you notice, what actions you take, what results you create. If you see yourself as someone who struggles with money, you'll create financial struggle. If you see yourself as someone who has bad relationships, you'll create dysfunctional relationships. If you see yourself as someone who's stuck, you'll create stuckness. Not because you want those outcomes, but because your identity is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Your subconscious mind works tirelessly to keep your external reality aligned with your internal identity. But the beautiful, empowering, life-changing truth is this: your identity is not fixed. It's not determined by your past, your genes, your circumstances, or anyone else's opinion of you. Your identity is a choice. It's a story you tell yourself about who you are. And like any story, it can be rewritten. When David stepped into that valley, he was still a shepherd in everyone else's eyes. But in his own consciousness, he was already a giant slayer. He was already someone who did impossible things. He was already operating from an identity that transcended his circumstances, and because he held that identity so strongly, reality had no choice but to rearrange itself to match. This is your invitation. This is the culmination of everything we've explored together through these pages. You've learned about the giants that everyone faces, about the consciousness that's cultivated in hidden moments, about the power of decision and preparation and authenticity and internal transformation. You've learned about running toward the impossible, about precision and momentum, about what happens when the giant falls and how to integrate that victory. But all of that knowledge, all of those principles, all of that wisdom means nothing if you don't use it to transform your identity, because you can take all the right actions, follow all the right strategies, do everything perfectly, and still not experience lasting transformation if you're doing it all while holding on to an old identity that doesn't support your new life. The journey from shepherd to king isn't about external circumstances improving. It's about internal identity evolving. David didn't become king because he defeated Goliath. He defeated Goliath because he'd already become the kind of person who defeats giants. The throne was just the external reflection of the internal transformation that had already occurred. And your throne, your destiny, your purpose, your greatest life is waiting for you, not in some external circumstance, but in the identity you choose to embody right now, in this moment, regardless of your current reality. So here's the question that will determine everything about your future. Who are you becoming? Not who were you. Not who are you right now based on your current circumstances, but who are you becoming? Who is the version of you that has already defeated the giant? Who is the person you'll be on the other side of your transformation? What do they believe about themselves? How do they move through the world? What actions do they take naturally because those actions align with who they are? What do they no longer tolerate because it doesn't match their identity? Get clear on that person. See them in your mind with absolute precision. Feel what it's like to be them, and then make a radical decision. You're going to start being that person right now. Not when the circumstances change, not when the giant falls. Right now, today, in this moment. This is how transformation becomes permanent. This is how you go from shepherd to king. You don't wait for the external world to validate your new identity. You claim it first in consciousness, and then you live from it consistently until the external world has no choice but to reflect it back to you. You make decisions as that person would make them. You speak as that person would speak. You carry yourself as that person would carry themselves. At first, it will feel like you're pretending, like you're playing a role. That's normal. That's actually necessary. You're trying on a new identity, practicing it, learning how it fits. But if you stay with it, if you refuse to revert to your old identity even when circumstances tempt you to, something remarkable happens. The new identity stops feeling like a role you're playing and starts feeling like who you actually are. And when that shift occurs internally, when your new identity becomes your natural state of being, your external reality transforms to match it. Not through magical thinking, but through the natural law that consciousness creates reality. David lived the rest of his life as a king. Even in the years before he sat on a physical throne, he'd touched a level of consciousness, accessed a dimension of his own power, stepped into an identity that could never be taken from him. Every battle he fought, every challenge he faced, every moment of triumph and tragedy, he met as someone who knew what he was capable of because he'd already done the impossible. And you have that same capacity. You've already done impossible things in your life. Even if you don't recognize them as such, you've survived challenges that could have destroyed you. You've grown beyond limitations that seemed permanent. You've created results that once seemed unreachable. You are not who you were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 1 year ago. You've been evolving all along. The only question is whether you'll evolve consciously, deliberately, in the direction of your highest potential, or whether you'll evolve randomly, reactively, in whatever direction circumstances push you. Choose conscious evolution. Choose to become who you're meant to be, rather than who circumstances have conditioned you to be. Choose to see yourself as the giant slayer, the miracle worker, the impossible doer that you actually are when you strip away all the limiting beliefs and false identities. Choose to step into your valley, face your giant, and discover in that moment of courage who you've always been beneath the fear. And then choose, every single day for the rest of your life, to live from that truth, to embody that identity, to be that person so consistently that your new identity becomes as natural as breathing. This is your birthright. This is your destiny, not because you're special or chosen or better than anyone else, but because you're human. And every human being carries within them the capacity for transformation, for courage, for stepping beyond their perceived limitations and into their divine potential. David wasn't superhuman. He was fully human. And in his full humanity, in his willingness to face his giant despite being small and young and inexperienced, he activated something that exists in every person who has ever lived. He stepped into the truth of who he really was, and in that truth, he became unstoppable. Your giant is waiting. Your valley is before you. Your stones are in your hand. Everything you need is already within you. The only question that remains is, will you run? Will you aim? Will you trust? Will you become? The choice is yours. It's always been yours. And on the other side of that choice, on the other side of your courage, on the other side of your willingness to face the impossible, a throne awaits. Not a literal throne of gold and jewel, but the throne of your own empowered life, your own fulfilled purpose, your own transformed identity. From shepherd to king, from limited to limitless, from who you were to who you're becoming. The journey starts now. The transformation is already happening, and the giant, no matter how big it appears, has already fallen in the realm of consciousness, where all outcomes are first determined. All that remains is for you to run into that valley and claim the victory that's been waiting for you all along.